This is the Special Committee on Voter Confidence meeting on Monday, August 15th. As is our custom at these meetings, we have generally two sessions. The first session is a presentation by invited presenters to give their perspectives on various aspects of the voting process in New Hampshire and voter confidence or suggestions for improvement. And the second session is public comment. So without further ado, we've invited representatives of the major political parties today.
Good afternoon. I'm Ray Buckley, and I have had the honor of serving as chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party for the past 15 years. And I'm joined today by our staff attorney, our voter protection director, Attorney Emma Mintz, who will be able to assist me in answering any technical questions. She has grand experience from across the country in voter protection issues in many other states. So I've been involved with every election in one form or another since I volunteered on my first campaign in 1968. Bet you remember that, Brad. I volunteered, served as a staffer, as a candidate, and elected official to poll worker, and now as chair of the state party. I also served 18 years in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, where I served for 8 years on the Election Law Commission. I have seen our elections up close and personal, and while I may not always like the results of an election, I am damn proud of our elections here in New Hampshire. You know, I love talking to young people across the state and explain to them that in all of human history, there has never been at one point where 1.3 million people have had such direct democracy like we do here in New Hampshire. And we should do everything that we can to preserve this honor and responsibility that we have. Our entire state government being up every 2 years, 400-member House. You only have to be 18 years of age to run for the House or for any municipal office or a county position. Every year we elect over 4,000 municipal offices, and from the person that plows the road to the person who serves as library trustee. And in many towns, we still have the town meeting where every citizen can come and make their voice heard. New Hampshire has historically had among the highest number of registered voters and turnout. Most importantly, we have shown throughout our history that our elections are the cleanest, most fair, and most accurate of any place in the country. We should take pride in this and not try to undermine our great tradition. But an effort has been underway for decades to do just that, and unfortunately it continues today. So today, I'm going to talk about where the myth of voter suppression began, the impact it's had on our state, and what we think should be done to improve our elections. I believe that everyone has a copy of the slides. And so we broke it down, as I said, 3 sections: the origins, the impact, and our proposals. So the origins of voter suppression and the voter fraud myth in New Hampshire. There is a nationwide voter suppression trend, and is sweeping across the country. There's a national campaign to undermine confidence in elections. Over the past decade, the United States Supreme Court has rolled back federal voting rights protection. In 2022, legislators in 49 states drafted more than 440 restricted voting bills, 34 of which became law. Congress recently failed to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Now, while voter suppression is a national trend, the New Hampshire Republican Party has been at it for decades. In the Granite State, the techniques have varied, but the intent has remained the same: stopping Democrats from participating in our democracy. In 1996, the myth began by the river in Hudson. The voter fraud myth began when Jean Shaheen won the 1996 race for governor. I was a member of the House Election Law Committee in 1997, and we heard Republican after Republican testify that they saw buses of Massachusetts voters coming to New Hampshire. When we asked, well, what color was this bus? What was the name of the bus? If they voted, they must have registered. What was the name of even one of those people? Of course, it was a lie. In 2002, they jammed our phone lines. When then Governor Shaheen ran for the U.S. Senate in 2002, Republicans jammed phone lines of all of our local headquarters and the phone lines to the Manchester firefighters who were giving rise to polls to citizens who simply wanted to vote. And the Republican State Party was forced to pay the New Hampshire Democratic Party $125,000 in fines. Trump's baseless claims of voter fraud added fuel to this fire. In 2016, President Trump spread false election claims. Trump claimed falsely on Twitter that serious voter fraud in New Hampshire was to blame for his and Senator Ayott's losses here in New Hampshire. He reiterated the false claim that thousands of voters, get this, were bussed in from Massachusetts, still with not a single piece of evidence. Nobody actually could describe the bus. Nobody could describe anyone getting off the bus. Nobody could describe anyone that voted. And there was no evidence of this, of people who voted to take their registration. In post-2016 lies about New Hampshire elections proliferate. Democratic wins, both statewide and locally, have led the New Hampshire Republicans to attempt to disenfranchise Democratic voters rather than compete on ideas. The New Hampshire Republican Party continues to spew misinformation to undermine confidence in New Hampshire's elections and further the big lie. Elected officials, including Republican Governor Chris Newman, know that voter fraud is nothing more than a lie. As recently as 2021, Governor Newman pushed back against Trump's claim of voter fraud in New Hampshire, saying New Hampshire's voting process is the most reliable, safe, and secure in the country, and that we will ensure every last vote is accurately accounted for. The New Hampshire Republican Party knows that voter fraud is missed. It is clear that the Republicans use the unfounded claims of voter fraud to discourage people from voting and advance voter suppression efforts. The New Hampshire Republican Party is not interested in improving New Hampshire's elections. It is interested in its own power and to undermine democracy in order to achieve it. The impact of voter suppression and the voter fraud myth here in New Hampshire. Persistent Republican lies have led to attempts to suppress the voter vote through the legislature. In 2017, SB 3 required voters to provide documentary evidence of verifiable act or acts carrying out their intent to be domiciled in New Hampshire to register, resulted in a lawsuit that cost the state millions of dollars and was declared unconstitutional. When introducing SB 3, Republican Senator Regina Birchall justified the measures as necessary response to the perception that New Hampshire elections had been adversely impacted by voter fraud. The same perception we hear peddled today in lieu of actual facts. She had no facts to point to because voter fraud is a myth. While it costs the state millions of dollars, the SB 3 litigation revealed the false underpinnings of voter fraud myth the Republicans have spent decades advancing. Dartmouth professor Michael Eyring explained the prevalence of voter fraud. There was a single case of voter fraud in 2016, representing a voter fraud rate of 0.0166% when compared to the number of domicile affidavits signed, 6,033, and 0.00013 compared to the number of total ballots cast that year, 755,850. Prior elections had similar low rates of fraud, 0.0006%, 76% in 2006, 0.0014% in 2008, 0.00087 in 2010. According to the trial court, SB3's penalties acted as a very serious deterrent on the right to vote. And if there is indeed a compelling need for them, the court is yet to see it. The trial court rejected the state's argument that any burden imposed was justified by the state's interest in preventing and protecting against wrongful voting and or voter fraud, noting that, as documented through the preliminary injunction hearing and as acknowledged by the legislature, voter fraud is not widespread or even remotely commonplace. As the New Hampshire Republicans' radicalized voter suppression efforts are intensifying, in 2022, the New Hampshire Republican Party supported SB 418, sponsored by former Oath Keeper, State Senator Bob Guider, which threatens to force thousands of voters to cast provisional ballots in future elections based entirely on the voter fraud minimum. The bill is reckless and dangerous and even threatens the state's ability to get ballots to overseas military in time. In 2022, New Hampshire Republicans pushed egregiously gerrymandered congressional, state, legislative, and executive council maps designed to suppress the voice of red staters based on their partisan affiliations. Republicans want to pick their voters rather than have voters pick their representatives. Senate Bill 3 and Senate Bill 418 are just two examples of the countless voter suppression bills the New Hampshire Republicans have supported in the legislature. We have seen a repeated pattern of restrictive legislation proposed by Republicans over the years targeting particular groups of voters, including students, the unhoused, the impoverished, seasonal workers, people with physical, mental, and cognitive disabilities. Voter suppressions create subtle and unsubtle barriers to voting. The Republican strategy is to create as many obstacles to the ballot box as possible. They know when voting is hard, fewer voters are able to cast a ballot. First-time New Hampshire voters hear the myths and the threats. It's intimidating, it's wrong, and it's anti-democratic. Small. If you're 18 years of age or older, a U.S. citizen and domiciled in our great state, you are an eligible voter. You should feel welcome at the polls. Local election officials, our clerks, moderators, and supervisors of the checklist should be applauded, not vilified. It's clear that voter fraud is a myth. For decades, a systematic campaign has been underway across the country to cast doubt on our elections and suppress voter turnout and confidence. New Hampshire has a proud tradition of voter participation. This commission should loudly and clearly state that voter fraud does not exist in New Hampshire and denounce any efforts to have the cast doubt on our elections. Our takeaways are: elections in New Hampshire are safe and secure. New Hampshire Republicans have engaged in a systematic decades-long campaign to suppress voter turnout, and there are simple steps to be taken to strengthen our elections here in New Hampshire. Here are some of our proposals from the New Hampshire Democratic Party platform and our values. The New Hampshire Democratic Party believes that the state should protect the right of every eligible voter to vote, protect the constitutional rights of all without discrimination, that we have free and fair elections in New Hampshire, and it requires that in our state, voting is a right and a responsibility, not a privilege. All eligible voters must be able to register, cast a ballot, and have their ballot counted in every election. Voter registration should be as easy as possible. New Hampshire should build upon same-day registration to include automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration and continuing the same-day registration is the way forward. The New Hampshire Democratic Party believes that this committee should consider the following changes, which would strengthen election administration in New Hampshire. 1, adopt a no-excuse absentee voting, allowing every Granite Stater to vote by mail. 2, implement more pathways in voter registration. Create a system where Granite Staters can register to vote when interacting with the government agencies such as New Hampshire Division of Motor Vehicles. Permit towns and cities to install secure drop boxes for voters to drop off their absentee ballots in a secure location. Permanently allow the pre-processing of absentee ballots. This practice was adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic and assisted local election officials in managing their election day workload. 6, implementing risk-limiting audits to verify the accuracy of election results. And 7, join the Electronic Registration Information Center, otherwise known as Eyring, the most trusted resources for states to conduct cross-state voter registration checks. In addition to our recommendations on improving election registration, the New Hampshire Democratic Party unequivocally supports the repeal of Senate Bill 418. As a reminder, Senate Bill 418 creates unconstitutional provisions, provisional ballots that would require ballots to be counted after election day. Risks the state's ability to provide full election results on election night, and undermines the state's ability to comply with the UOCAVA, and puts our First Nation status at risk. In addition to formal changes to election administration, the NHDB supports increased voter education efforts from the Secretary of State to ensure that New Hampshire, local, state, and federal elections are conducted openly, fairly, and in accordance with the New Hampshire Constitution. The Secretary of State should conduct voter education efforts focused on the following: voter eligibility, ID requirements, and New Hampshire's voter registration procedure. Thank you very much, and either I or Emma answer any of your questions.
Questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman, I have a lot of questions. Very well done presentation. Again, as sitting up here as a registered Republican, I feel a little bit one-sided looking at your presentation to some of my beliefs, but I did have some questions. You kept mentioning no voter fraud, yet in the presentation there are multiple cases. Could your lawyer friend tell us of the cases that were heard, how many were actually proven as fraud?
I'm sorry. The question that you're asking is how many cases of voter fraud have been proven?
Yeah, so you got 3 investigations, 10 investigations, 4 investigations. So when they said there's no voter fraud.
So I think the point is there is very, very minimal voter fraud that happens in the state of New Hampshire.
None and minimal. I'm sorry.
So
that's why I asked, because when you say no voter fraud, okay, and then we have investigations, I just want to know the outcomes if there was proven.
So there were 3 investigations in 2006.
Yep.
Out of 393, 56 ballots.
So were those 3 proven fruitful?
They were.
So there was 3 cases of fraud.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to 2008, 10.
Yes.
Okay, so 10 cases of fraud.
Yes.
And there were 4 cases of fraud?
Yes.
Okay. That's why when it says none,
So the
and
point,
there's some.
Mr. Georgevits, is that to disenfranchise potentially thousands of other voters, because 0.00076, meaning 3 people somewhere in the state of New Hampshire. Now, I'm not even going to remind you that often it's Republicans.
And again, it might be, but at this point of saying, and that's where, again, this committee is trying to prove to people that they should have confidence. So when one major party is saying no fraud, and yet
When
there is.
something is 99.99924%, you don't think that's good enough?
Again, none to some, or little, or slim.
I think you made your
Yes.
point. Go ahead. Go on.
I'll conclude.
No, you said you had more questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Other questions? Ken?
Thank you for your wisdom. Sorry.
I can hear you.
Can you people out here hear me? Okay, because I can't hear back in the speakers, and I speak softly, so let me know if I speak too soft. So I have a few questions. Thank you again for your presentation. On your page that says going forward, you have an item on there that says the commission should loudly and clearly state that voter fraud does not exist in New Hampshire and denounce any efforts that have cast doubt on our elections. And I agree with that, except for one thing. I'd like to ask you a question. This committee has heard people testify that they have proof, they've submitted documents and affidavits. Do you believe that we should investigate that before we make a statement to denounce any efforts to ensure that the evidence and the documentation and the concerns that have been provided to us are not valid?
Well, my experience, as I discussed, that the myth or the lie of the buses that have continued now for nearly 30 years, there's zero evidence, though people were testifying in the legislature that indeed people were, but that they saw voters, though they couldn't describe them. They couldn't describe how they got there. They didn't describe what name they registered under or how they voted or what happened that day, other than they swore that there were busloads of Massachusetts voters going to Hudson, of all places.
No, I understand that. If there's no proof or evidence, just blanket statements, I agree that you can't give any credence or credibility to that. But we have people who have provided sworn affidavits that have been notarized that testify that people have voted from people have been registered as voters from addresses with the people who live there did not vote. They've testified that they did not vote on that day. So that's something that I feel that this committee should look into before we make a blanket statement that says that that denounces any effort to cast out, because I don't believe they're trying to cast out. I think they're just trying to explain the concerns that there may be issues, and they're asking for, through this committee, to the Secretary of State, that those concerns be looked at. Would you agree that they should be looked at?
Far be it for me to instruct this commission to how to do their work, but I'm sure you'll do an excellent job. But I know that at the end of the day, the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the local elected officials will be found to have run an amazingly clean record.
Thank you for that. I was just looking to clarify your statement. We've got a couple more, just okay, Mr. Chisholm? Okay, so on the HGP recommendations, you are recommending to permit towns and cities to install secure drop boxes for voters to drop off their absentee ballots. Would you define in your mind what you consider to be secure?
I don't think it should be just a box on the side of the road. It should be some sort of a location where people that need to enter. There are oftentimes in some of the small towns, the town clerk's office isn't necessarily open, but the town hall itself is, and they could have a box. The point being is that if you fill out an absentee ballot application and you put it in an envelope, and you put your return address on it, and you put a stamp on it, it automatically gets accepted. If you fill out the absentee ballot, put the address on it, put your return address on it, and simply put it in a secure location in the town hall, the city hall, whatever it is determined by the legislature, what the definition of a secure lockbox is. The only difference is that it didn't cost the voter 57 cents to vote.
Do you think there should be cameras on this? Is that part of the security?
Once again, a voter at home would fill out the application, put it in an envelope, address it to their town clerk or moderator, whatever they need, put their return address, and put a stamp on it. We're suggesting that if you're at home, you fill out the application, put it in an envelope, address it to the town clerk or whoever, put their return address, and be able to put it in a box that is secured and controlled by the local government.
I appreciate that. I was just
So
wondering what you meant by secure.
what the difference would be is zero, other than they didn't put a stamp on it, they happened to drop it off themselves. The amount of alleged voter fraud, if their suggestion that somebody would just simply put in multiple applications into this secure box, so we're required, what would be the difference of somebody doing the same thing with applications with a stamp on it? It simply doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. I got two more, sir. On the repeal recent voter suppression bill, SB 418, the first bullet point says creates unconstitutional provision. Ballots that would require ballots to be counted after election day. Respectfully, that's not the case. They would be counted on election day. They just would not be certified until after the Secretary of State's office receives validation that they met all of the legal voting requirements in New Hampshire. And Secretary Scanlon is here. He testified to this bill, and if I said anything wrong, I ask for him to correct me right now.
When 418 is implemented, days after the election, if a voter does not return their ID to the Secretary of State, their ballot can be removed from the count, which is, in essence, the same thing as counting it days after. There's no practical difference.
Well, I'm not going to get into back and forth because we're here to listen, but for clarity purposes, I want people to know for the record that that's not how the bill is written, that it's really just written to count the votes. It will be reported on election night, and it's an obligation of the voters to provide their documentation that they are legally certified to vote in the state, and if they don't prove that requirement within, I believe, 7 days, I think the bill was modified, then their votes will be removed. But they have not shown at that point by 7 days that they were qualified voters. And if they're not qualified voters, their votes should not be counted.
There are many voters who are qualified voters in the state of New Hampshire who do not have an ID, within that 7-day period may not be able to get their ID, and those people are still qualified voters that deserve to vote in the state of New Hampshire.
Okay, well, I appreciate your testimony. I have one more comment on your presentation. It says it risks the state's ability to provide full election results on election night, and I think I covered that in my previous bullet point, saying that it would be reported, but it would not be certified on election night. And up until now, our votes have not been certified on election night. They are certified, I don't know how many days later, a week, 2 weeks later, so.
Well, actually,
they're not official results anyway.
it's a month later. The legislature certifies the election, Secretary of State office. But the number differential for what is announced that evening and what is officially certified by the legislature a month later is extraordinarily small. It's not been anything that has ever been of importance. But if you're thinking about the presidential primary, where it is not unknown that 90,000 New Hampshire people will register to vote on the same day. 90,000. Now, there's a lot of hoopla, a lot of things going on. It's winter, storms, whatnot. 10,000 of them, for whatever reason, don't get back. So those 10,000 votes are subtracted a week after. And so if you look at the results of the presidential primaries, 10,000 votes, it is not unheard of that the difference between who comes in first, second, and third is 10,000 votes.
So, the purpose of this committee, as defined to me personally by Secretary Scanlon, is to seek the reasons why voters might have a lack of confidence in our elections. And that is not necessarily voter claims or voter fraud. The AG's office, and jointly with the Secretary of State's office, put together a report that took them over a year to put together regarding regarding the Windham election results for November 3rd, 2020, and it reflected 130 violations of election law and procedures. And would you agree that those are concerns that should be addressed?
I think that we discovered the extraordinary anomaly that occurred in Windham where the fold of the ballot was placed in a position that it get counted as a vote, and it has now been corrected, so that will never happen again. Now, I have not looked through all dozens and dozens, and I'm sure there might be something that they may not have done one thing or another, but did it impact the actual results of the election? I don't believe that's true.
So, I agree with you changing results, but I don't think that's a reason to ignore the fact that there were anomalies. And I lost my train of thought. Can I come back? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your candid answers.
Any questions?
Yeah, I apologize for my late arrival. People have been complaining about driving to the North Country, and I think coming to Nashua is my equivalent of having to drive to the North Country from the North Country, but...
Doug, as I recall, when we served on election law committee, you weren't always on time.
Well, I'll take that as a fair criticism, and I was going to point out that Chairman Buckley and I did serve in the legislature together, and I do recall that we sat one row apart back in the days when the legislator had mixed seating, and I think it was a travesty when the legislator went to all the Republicans on one side and all the Democrats on the other side, which I believe was initiated by the Democrats, but it's been continued by the Republicans. And I think that that's very unfortunate. I think you and I were both in the legislature when the HAVA was passed. And I was interested in your recommendation about DMV, because I know there was a lot of concern about registering through DMV, and the trade-off we came up with was we're going to do same-day voter registration. And I think that that's served us well, but I was just surprised to see you wanting to go back to registration through DMV, and I was also a little surprised to see the no excuse absentee voting. I mean, I agree with your contention that, you know, we haven't had a lot of voter fraud, but aren't you, are you not at all concerned that, you know, the system's working? Why do we need these additional changes?
The 93 session in the legislature where we passed the same-day voter registration, when then Senator Gregg made the exception in the U.S. Senate floor that was able to make the change that we would be the sole state that would not have to have a voter in exchange for same-day voter registration. I wasn't at that point, for the record, sold on same-day voter registration. And actually voted against that because I felt that voter was a proactive versus a reactive, and I thought that we should be proactive. If you look at it first took effect in 1996, and if you look at the election results from 1996 to 2020, I was clearly proven wrong, since the majority of the races Democrats have won. The idea is not to do it either or, Doug. It is to do both. That to be reactive in the sense of you go to your polling location and register to vote and vote that day. Proactive is when you are engaged with a government entity, say, are you a registered voter? Would you like to fill out this form? So there's two different things. It's really a way of making sure. Bottom line isn't to help one candidate or one party or anything. It is to make sure that every single person who's eligible to vote in New Hampshire gets to vote, and that their votes are counted correctly. If you recall, that's sort of the mantra that we had at the beginning of our election law committee, at the beginning every 2 years, that was what our guiding North Star would be. Is that it wouldn't be what's best for a party, or what's best for the clerks, or what's best for the Secretary of State, but what's best for the voter. And I believe that's what these proposals are.
Chairman Swett.
Chairman Buckley, thank you for your testimony. It's great to see you and appreciate the effort you put into the presentation. I want to go back to what Ken was talking about earlier, which is really the reason why we're here, and that is to find ways to build voter confidence in our electoral system. And as you made your presentation, I'm very curious to understand better one thing that you talked about, and that is if someone comes and registers on the same day of the election, and I've done this in my own town of Bow, they have the right to register and sign an affidavit and then cast their ballot and then depart. And you mentioned up to 10 days later that affidavit could be proven incorrect. My concern is, how is this a secret ballot if we are going to extract their vote and make it null and void?
Are you referring to what might happen under 418?
No, just as a hypothetical.
So-
Because how do you build confidence in a system
Yeah.
that doesn't protect
So
the
that's not
privacy of the vote?
what our system does now. That is what the system would do under SB 418. And we totally agree that that would make people have less confidence in our elections, because there would be less confidence in the secret ballot and many other reasons. So we believe that the legislature should repeal SB 418.
So could you explain for the audience what currently happens if those affidavits prove to be inaccurate? How are those individuals dealt with?
So you mean, so right now, when somebody signs an affidavit, they're sent a letter.
Yeah.
And if the letter, I believe if the letter is not returned, then they can investigate it. So that the people who fill out an affidavit on election day can be investigated for if they,
But their vote is counted.
Vote is always
And it's
counted,
part of the
yes.
system.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear, because that's something that I think it's important for people to know. I agree entirely with the section about education. There are a lot of things that go on election day and in the election process that many people don't know and don't understand. And I think clarifying those things will give them a much stronger sense of confidence in the electoral process. So thank you.
I think it's important to note that over these last 25 years, there have been dozens of individuals that have recklessly charged in the media, on blogs, that there are literally thousands upon thousands of voters, and that they're going to prove, and then you get the real statistics here. And think back, did you hear anything about like this before 1996? This isn't about voter fraud. This is about rigging elections.
One of your recommendations is the risk limiting audit. Do you have a sense of what percentages of ballots should be cast, or what system of audit is one you recommend? And then also, many of the changes you recommend are required legislation. Do you have any other recommendations that might not require legislative changes, but that might be updates to the website or other things that could be done without policy changes?
So we have, the education piece is certainly something that would not require any legislative changes. And I think that that's something that, the Secretary of State's office certainly can do, and can do a really great job of. The question you had about risk limiting audits, can you actually ask the question again?
There's been a couple of different policies, 5% ballots should be audited, or so many towns should be audited. Do you have any, I think there's 6 or 7 different types of risk limiting audits. Do you have one? And again, if you want to look at it and investigate and email back about which types of audits you would recommend for New Hampshire.
Yeah, so I don't think that we have a specific position on which type of audit the party would recommend. We do firmly believe that it needs to be random and would not, cannot in any way be biased towards certain cities or towns, but we don't have a recommendation on the specific type or the specific percentage.
Did the train get back to the station?
I did, yeah, my senior moment went away. You had mentioned that with Windham, that it was discovered through the audit that polls were a problem. But that's not main part of the AG's and Secretary of State's report. I just want to get that on the record. There were issues with errors in the process for testing the machines, for the chain of custody records, for properly securing the ballots after the elections, and also just ensuring that election officials are qualified to perform their duties. So I just wanted to make that statement to you, to kind of clarify the work that the Secretary of State's office did. And these issues, I'm just bringing them up because they appear to be valid issues for people who have a lack of confidence. And so these are issues that should be looked at and addressed to ensure that, the people who are running our elections, perhaps weren't educated so that these types of mistakes are minimized in the future.
Absolutely. We have always strongly believed in a much more aggressive effort in the training. In the city of Manchester, if you don't go to the training, you don't get paid. So you do, who wants to give up 18 hours, 20 hours, whatever long it takes, and not get it done? And that's really, I think those sorts of things would be critically important. As you've probably been informed, the New Hampshire Democratic Party in the last 6 years have aggressively stepped up our game with the ballot inspectors, with parties the ability to appoint observers who actually are not just observers, who are actually workers within the party, and that brings in fresh eyes. So the Republican Party and the Democratic Party each get to name individuals to work that aren't elected, but actually work either checking out names, handing the ballot, doing whatever is assigned to them. I think if the Republican Party would join us in that and to make sure that there are well-trained, well-qualified individuals representing both parties inside, in the process, part of it, I think that would do a lot to guarantee people's feeling that their vote is secure. That said, this really isn't an election problem. We're not going to stop Donald J. Trump from lying about voter fraud. We're not going to stop people with blogs here in New Hampshire from lying about voter fraud. They're making a lot of money off of it. It's a great scam, and it's really a near impossible thing. This commission is not going to be able to satisfy every single voter because they're being fed non-stop lines of nonsense.
I agree with you, both parties should work together. I applaud your willingness to make that a public statement, reach out to the Republicans. Just to wrap up my thoughts, I don't believe anyone on this committee is looking at this as a Trump-related issue. This is all.
No, I know it's true. No, I know you're not.
Okay, a few from me. I think it's true, if I understand it correctly, that the audit bill passed the legislature this year. We're going to start having audits. Isn't that correct? So it's a good recommendation. I think it's already happened. We've heard a lot about, and I applaud what Ken and Dick both said about, this isn't necessarily about fraud. This is about confidence in the elections. And there are a whole lot of things that people hear or people see. I mean, the Windham elections on election day, on the recount, at the ballot law commission, and at the audit, the same people won the election. And I agree with you that that's the key thing about elections is the person who gets the most vote wins. But if there are 130 things that happen that weren't right, it raises a bunch of issues.
But I think, just to answer a little bit, part of that is our state statutes are written, forgive me, those who are religious, it essentially declares that the moderator is God on election day when it comes to anything with that. And it's impossible to question them because they will call the Secretary of State's office and Secretary of State's office, yes, you're in charge. And we have, for 5-6 elections in a row, deployed several hundred attorneys to work with moderators to understand their job. In most towns, there are moderators that run these elections that have been moderators for decades, and they do a phenomenal job. But in a lot of places, they're simply the person who put the name on the ballot because nobody else wants to do it. They have no background, no experience, no real interest in making sure that this is done perfectly. So I do think that there should be some mechanism in there that allows people to more easily question the moderator. I do believe that having served as a moderator, the training for moderators specifically need to be significantly more. And what happens is somebody who's been a moderator for 3, 4, 10, 30 elections, they think they know everything. They forget that the legislature meets every year and changes the law. And trying to explain to them on election day that they're doing something wrong, and they lose their patience with the person that's saying, no, it's right here. So I do think that maybe toning down the rhetoric of empowering the moderator to be the supreme ruler of election, making sure that they are updated, that they're trained, not just once, but every single cycle, at least once every 2 years, and updated. I don't believe that they routinely read the updates. That has certainly not been my experience over the last 40 years.
We've heard a lot of testimony from people, and you've heard a lot of people question, and there were efforts in a lot of towns to do away with vote counting devices, which we generically call machines, because they're supposedly not accurate. Does the Democratic Party have any position on getting rid of, relying on, having faith in the vote counting devices and what we should be doing in the future?
I inherently, after all of these years, trust these machines specifically, not any machines, but these machines that we've had far more than I would hand count. The average poll worker, I would say, is probably 70. Oh, I'm sorry, 80. Like close to your age. Yeah. In that you can only imagine to have, like in Manchester where the polls open at 6 a.m. So that means you have to be there at 5. That means you have to get up at 4. And there's precious little break time, trust me, because it's nonstop, at least in Manchester. And you work right through the polls close at 7 o'clock. And this is another 2 hours of work. You can imagine then doing the counting, that you've got the group of individuals that are absolutely exhausted. I've participated in hundreds of recounts and have seen unlimited errors, human errors in the recounts, where somebody would catch, say, oh no, look at that. But we're refreshed. We might have only been counting for half an hour. We didn't get up, while it was still dark, and we were able to catch them during the recounts. But to the concept that we would have these near volunteers be responsible for counting thousands of ballots accurately, I think would bring much more error than these machines have ever proven to do. And if you look at the recounts versus the results of the machine vote, it is often identical, off maybe 1 or 2 or 3. My first election for the legislature, it was off by 1, and I gained a vote in the recount because the Secretary of State's office correctly said that a smudge on the ballot was a vote for me.
You recommended Eyring. Eyring is designed to compare from states, whether anybody voted twice and that sort of thing. And but then there was a competing version, so suddenly somehow Eyring has been seen as the Democrat version, and then there was another version. And we've had testimony supporting Eyring, but we've also had people saying, don't rely on Eyring. And I guess it comes down to how everything has become so polarized. But do you have, what could you say that would give us confidence in Eyring?
Many states across the country use Eyring. It is very safe. It is a secure way to have your data compared against the data of other states. And it is just a really great way for us to be able to have clean voter rolls, and, compare against other states' information. guess what is your question about the safety of the data that goes into Eyring, or,
Well, I think my question is, I guess it's like everything we're trying to do here, it's become so polarized. It's just very hard to find something like that particular issue, which on the surface you would think it might have some universal appeal, but then there was a competing version, and I just don't, I mean, I'm going forward and we're looking for things that we can recommend, and I think we've got quite a few things. We haven't actually had a discussion, but I think we've heard a lot of testimony. But I struggle with Eyring as a recommendation, particularly because it seems like it's become so polarized, and I don't know if you have any particular insights on it.
so there are many states that legalize Eyring that have Republican legislatures that they find it safe and secure to use, and I think that we should as well. It is a nonpartisan organization.
Now, this is a discussion, I'm not speaking on behalf of the party, but we'll imagine that we're back in committee. And what I would say as well, every morning my father gets up and puts a belt on his pants and puts his suspenders on. So if it is affordable, why not do both?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Butler.
Thank you.
Anything else? Great.
The next speaker will be William O'Brien, the former Speaker of the House and Counsel to the Republican Party.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hopefully there's some time left for me here.
As much as you need.
I do appreciate the opportunity to come forward here. Secretary Scanlon, thank you for setting up this committee, and all the members who are serving on it. I was going to say I have a half-hour limitation in my public presentations informed by the years that I spent at the House well. And you have 3 minutes there. So I'm not sure that I can do it in 3 minutes, but I will try to be cognizant of all those who are behind me that would like to speak as well. You know, I heard about a myth. There is a myth about it. And the myth is that Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. And it's a myth that's of the same genre as Republicans are racist, or Republicans engage in misogyny, Republicans hate transgender people. It's a myth intended to cease discussion of issues because of insults. And so when we hear someone get up and start talking about Trump, we know that they've departed into the insult area of risk. We could bring up the equally fantastic Stacey Abrams, who lost the Georgia race by 50,000 votes, but still thinks she's governor of Georgia. You know, people don't like losing elections, and the fact that one candidate or another says they don't doesn't mean anything. But there are concerns. You know, voter suppression is not resisting having a federal takeover of New Hampshire elections. The bill mentioned Mr. Buckley. Voter suppression is in Georgia tightening up its post-COVID election laws so that they're still much more liberal than Joe Biden's Delaware. That's not voter suppression. And for us to be concerned that there's fraud is entirely correct. For us to put our head in the sand and say there's no fraud would ask all of us to ignore what is right in front of us. I remember when I was first myself on the Election Law Committee in 2005, and a Democrat member who was a resident of Massachusetts had to resign because she was a resident of Massachusetts. She managed to get herself elected to the New Hampshire legislature. I bet you she voted for herself. I bet you that was election fraud. But she had to resign. It's a concern. It's a concern that voters have when they see 6,500 voters come in 2016 and register with Massachusetts license to vote that day. When another 1,300 more come in with no identification and register. You know, that 6,500 would be about 100 buses. So who knows how they got here? We don't know. We don't know. We do know one thing, that when they register 3-to-1 Democrat. We're beginning to understand here why some would ask us to keep our rules loose. There is a concern here about voter integrity. There's a concern nationally. New Hampshire does very well. We have some real positive aspects of our voting procedure. We use paper ballots. You know, I've been going to conferences around the country and I hear horror stories. That won't happen with paper ballots. We have a record of what votes were taken. We have the requirement that all votes be counted the evening that the election is concluded until the count is completed. We won't have what we've seen, for example, in Georgia, Fulton County, where everybody's told to go home, and then the vote counting takes off again out of the sight of the public. So what we have concerns here, and I applaud your effort to discover what they are and to try to tighten up our procedures. I will tell you, I will warn you, that if you come up with tightened procedures, you too will be engaged in voter suppression. Because anything that adds integrity for some people is voter suppression. But I want to present to you 4 different subjects to my remarks. Here's what I want to cover. I want to tell you what the Republican National Committee and other Republican state organizations are doing to promote election integrity, how those efforts translate to New Hampshire, what we're doing here, how voters support our efforts, indications of voter support, and then recommendation for New Hampshire reforms. There is one goal that all Republicans have, the Republican National Committee, each state party has, and that's to make voting easy and to make it hard to cheat. We want make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And to achieve that goal, we take every opportunity throughout the country to add integrity to elections. We want our elections to be free, fair, and transparent. Consequently, the Republican National Committee this cycle has hired 17 separate election integrity directors, including one for New Hampshire. We have Election Integrity Council, my position, in 30 different states. We have signed up 17,000 poll workers across the country to do just what Mr. Buckley was talking about, observe what's going on. We have those poll workers, as I'll explain later, in New Hampshire. We signed up 15,000 poll watchers. Our efforts nationally are concentrated on 5 core integrity issues. One is voter ID, absentee signature matching, and I know there's a particular issue here with the court case that came down. I'll discuss that. Having bipartisan observers of the election process, including the county. Updating, make sure our voter rolls are current, and timely processing and counting of ballots. When voters are asked, do you support these 5 measures? 78% of voters responded saying, yes, we want our voting to reflect those reforms. So in order to achieve them, we're engaging in legal efforts. We've been intervening in 40 separate court cases and disputes. A good example of one of those was during the Virginia governor's election. Some election officials told individuals showing up to vote they had to have masks on. And what we did was get to the proper authorities. We went to those voters who were in line. We responded and said, hold on, stay, don't leave. Don't let your vote be suppressed. Stay so you can vote. And we got the Secretary of State in Virginia to correct that error. We have political efforts, as I described, made sure we have sufficient paid staff and volunteers in each state, and we're going to communicate our efforts to everyone so that they know that they can have confidence that their vote is being respected. This translates to New Hampshire by the fact that since this cycle began, we've had over 3,000 training sessions for 3,250 volunteers. We have activated over 650 poll workers. These are the inspectors of election. We have appointed 650 of them so that they can be the ballot clerks at polling places throughout New Hampshire. We've identified so far 600 poll watchers called, unfortunately, in New Hampshire, they have the term poll challengers. We don't want people to challenge votes. We want people to observe what's going on and, as was described, allow us to advise moderators if they're making mistakes or contact the Secretary's office if mistakes are being made. You know, it used to be that there was a bipartisan consensus around measures to achieve voter integrity. For example, after the Florida recount in the infamous Amy Chad election of 2000, a commission was put together by former President Jimmy Carter and former Republican Secretary of State James Baker, held 6 months of hearings, and it issued a report with 87 separate recommendations. We go over some of those recommendations because they have a familiar ring today. One of President Carter and Secretary Baker's recommendations was voter ID. One of the recommendations was keep your voter registration list updated. Another recommendation was to strictly control the use of absentee ballots because, as the report stated, and I quote from President Carter and Secretary Baker's report, what they said is absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. It hasn't changed since then. They talked about what we do, counting ballots in public. They recommended the use of provisional ballots where needed to subsequently verify the identity and the right to vote of voters. They recommended that voter fraud be prosecuted. Now, you would think that all of these would be something that any one of us would say, of course, let's make sure that we do what President Carter and what Secretary Baker, former Democrat leader in the Senate, Tom Daschle, former Republican leader in the House, Michael, 23 other members of that commission recommended. And yet we didn't. I can remember again when I was first on the election law committee in 2005. I was his first term rep. I was a little bit wet behind the ears. I was a little bit naive. I thought, well, heck, if I was assigned to the election law committee, I would look around, see what's being recommended, came across that report, filed some legislation, voter ID. You would have thought that I walked into a legislative buzzsaw. The other side of the aisle was firmly against voter ID. It was then and remains today against us being able to verify who come to our polls and vote. But the voters know better. 4 in 5 Americans support voter ID. That's polls taken by The Hill, which said 81%, Monmouth, 80%, Fox News, 77%. We've heard how there should be boxes for ballots to be dropped off, spread around the countryside of New Hampshire. Voters know better. 80% of voters oppose ballot harvesting, according to a poll taken by the New York Post. You know, our efforts and our observation of what is going on in New Hampshire have led us to specific recommendations. One is that we need to know that an absentee ballot that arrives at a polling station is legitimate. We can't match signatures, and I understand. I read the opinion, it made sense. But that doesn't mean that the signature can't be notarized, and signature should be notarized. We should tighten the availability of absentee ballots. You know, it's not like these are new issues. Back when the Constitution was drafted, they recognized that some people couldn't make it to the polls. They're away from the town award. They had a physical disability, but that was it. They said, if you're not there that day, in the Constitution, and I say Part 1, Article 11, says if you're not in your town award that day, then you can get an absentee ballot. If you're physically disabled, not convenience, not the fact that you just don't feel like going out. And it's not just trying to suppress. What it's trying to do is that we all focus in on a day, say that's where I'm going to vote that day. Everybody knows, you show up at the polls, people know who you are, you vote. We should eliminate election day voter tourism by reserving voters for voting for U.S. and New Hampshire citizens. Now, there was a constitutional amendment in the House and the Senate. It's called the CACR, Constitutional Amendment, Constitutional Resolution, that took before the legislative term that is just concluding now. The CACR 36 in the Senate, and I can't remember what the citation is in the House. That language simply stated, in order to vote in New Hampshire elections, you should be a U.S. citizen and a citizen of New Hampshire. And defines a citizen of New Hampshire as being someone who is domiciled here and has their primary residence here in New Hampshire. It is intended to address the court cases that have said, and I think I quote verbatim, you don't have to be a citizen of New Hampshire to vote in New Hampshire elections. With that CACR, and if it worked its way to the ballot, under the Constitution, it would have to be. I will note that every Republican in the Senate voted for that. Every Democrat in the Senate voted against it, against reserving voting for U.S. and New Hampshire citizens. In the House, I can't say that every Republican and Democrat voted for it because too many people don't show up, as I painfully am aware, on any given House session day. I will tell you that every voting Republican in the House voted for it, and every voting Democrat voted against it. That resolution, that constitutional amendment, will be for the House this upcoming term, so see if we can get it on the 2020 ballot. We recommend it's not a panacea, but it will be a foundation for integrity, making sure that it's our neighbors who join with us in deciding who our elected officials will be. It's our neighbors joining with us who will decide whether or not we should have expenditures at the local level, for example. We ought to require identification from anyone who votes. We should do away with affidavits. We should eliminate affidavits that are submitted by unknown people of unknown citizenship without documentation. New Hampshire residents who sign these affidavits and then walk away into the shadows. At the very least, we should do what Jimmy Carter and Secretary Baker recommended, have provisional ballots so that we can say, come back then. If for some reason you found yourself without any identification on yourself, without any indication that you live in New Hampshire, that you're a citizen, then come back. So those are the recommendations that we've made. We do, as I said, we do have substantial strength in New Hampshire. I would counsel you, though, as you go through your efforts, to be realistic and not be discouraged. Because the name of the Jimmy Carter and Secretary Baker, Jimmy Baker's report was Building Confidence in U.S. Elections. So it sounds like the title of this commission here. And of it issued a report that was 113 pages long, 87 separate recommendations. As I said, it had numerous distinguished members. but its efforts weren't followed, it didn't build confidence in elections. So they should revisit them, adopt some of them, and take what is not a bad system and make it better. Thank you.
But we've heard a lot of testimony and skepticism about the use of mechanical vote ballot counting devices, commonly known as machines. Does the Republican Party have any position on whether we should have or not have machines?
I've not been sent here to communicate a position on behalf of the Republican Party, but I will tell you that I think we ought to hand count our votes. You know, there's nothing saying that democracy is supposed to be quick and easy. There's always a concern that when you put votes into a machine and you get a readout, that there's a concern as to the accuracy of that readout. So let's make the additional effort. But again, that's my opinion.
I didn't quite get to this nuance with Mr. Buckley, but he talked about the divergence in training between some election officials and other election officials. And we all recognize that our local officials do a wonderful job, but training is somewhat voluntary for them. And we've heard testimony that it varies. Do you have any suggestions, or do you think we should make training more mandatory? I guess it's more mandatory means mandatory.
Right.
But should we make it mandatory, or should we have some kind of penalties or removal from office or non-payment or whatever you want to call it for those election officials that don't get trained?
So I've been a member of the Massachusetts Bar for 45 years and a member of the Hampshire Bar for 20 years. So I bet you I don't know as much as I did when I first walked out of the bar exam. And so it's probably a good idea to get periodically trained. I would agree with Mr. Buckley. I think if there's any specific reform in this area, it ought to be to require the moderators to take some sort of what I call CLE courses to get themselves up to speed and what the laws are, both help them be reminded of what the laws are, because sometimes issues will come up every year. And as well as Mr. Buckley said, it changes.
When we look at the election law book that the Secretary of State puts out, it's complicated. And it's varied, and lots of stuff is tucked in little places. Do you have any recommendations on maybe streamlining or simplifying the laws? I mean, they're cumulative. Obviously, the legislature tries to help each session, and when the legislature tries to help you, you could be in trouble. But do you have any comments about the complexity of the laws?
I'll give you my digest I came up with after the election, and you can potentially use that at the Secretary. You know, the circumstances involved voting can be varied and can be nuanced, and there's always the effort each term to address some of them, so it makes things fairly complicated. I do know when I was speaker at one point, I appointed a committee that was intended to go through the laws and like get rid of a bunch of them and recodify them beyond a Herculean effort. Very difficult to do.
And I appreciate your pointing out we hear a lot about absentee ballots, and New Hampshire's Constitution does pretty well state what reasons you can get an absentee ballot and what you can't. So when people, one of the things I think we need to point out to folks is we can make any recommendations we want, but if it takes more than a bill in the legislature, if it takes a constitutional amendment, that's a bigger hurdle to jump. Appreciate it. Other questions? Yeah, Ken?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for your testimony and for your service to our state. I have one question regarding training. Once people take, if that becomes mandatory, and I support that as well, do you believe that there should be certifications to show that they actually understand the training so that they can prove to the voters and have a high level of confidence to the voters that they understand the laws and procedures?
I hate licensing certifications. I think we have to take it one step at a time. If you can get them there and to get a certification of anything other than attendant, I think there's asked a lot for people who are really kind of volunteers.
Thank you for speaking about the need for clean voter rolls. The Democratic Party recommended Eyring, which 33 states are enrolled in. Do you have a recommendation of how we keep our election rolls clean?
Yeah, I was listening to you talk about Eyring, and I do, without being able to cite chapter and verse, I do know that it has some real problems. I think I talked to the secretary about it and to Attorney Fitch, and there's some problems. You should talk to the secretary. There's problems in Hampshire disclosing information into that system. But generally, the Republican Party is against using it.
Chairman Buckley brought up about approximately 90,000 same-day registrations, and in previous sessions, we've heard from the town clerk and the moderator of the Durham polls, where they have upwards from 3,000 to 6,000 same-day registrations. Do you feel that, again, as not the Republican Party as a whole, but just in general, those numbers of same-day registrations can easily sway a smaller town election? Do you feel that we should be making recommendations to tighten that up?
I think it's great that young people come in and vote. I really do. And I want every eligible young voter in Durham, Keene, the Republican Party wants every young voter in Durham and Keene, and Plymouth and Henniker, and wherever else we have colleges, to vote. We just want them to be a citizen with us in New Hampshire. We don't appreciate, for example, the sentiment expressed by a young woman from Dartmouth in the Dartmouth newspaper, in which she said, I really should be voting in Vermont, but my liberal vote doesn't, in California, she said, my liberal vote doesn't have much of an effect there. It does in New Hampshire. That's not a reason to vote. You should be voting in New Hampshire because you're a citizen here and you love the state the way we all do. And you're going to have to live with the decisions of the electorate. Whether they're your decision or not, you know that everybody joined together and majority decided, not majority including someone who really should be voting in California.
Thank you.
Your presentation, I don't believe we met before. I'm showing my age because I was in the legislature before you. And I was on the election law committee at least one term. And I remember serving on a study committee, this would have been in the 90s, about the issue of fraud, and it's been a rush. But I can remember I was on a summer study committee and it was very sleepy. Few people showed up.
Yeah, like most studies.
And it's just sort of accelerated, especially in the last maybe 6 years or whatever. And I'm discouraged at this inability for people to communicate. And I just saw a survey. Somebody said that I think it was 58 or 59% of Republican voters, this was national, not New Hampshire, but said that the 2020 election, the steal was a core element for the Republican Party. And how do we move forward? We're trying to move forward as a committee, and I almost hesitate to bring this up, but there's just so much out there, and we've had a lot of people come into this committee expressing concerns. There's some pretty tough stuff out there. I don't know if you've seen this video, Hacking New Hampshire Democracy. Somebody brought it up to our committee, and so I went and looked it up, and it started off with a little bit of data, and then, which was fine, and then it went on to the deep state, and they had Governor Sununu and Chuck Morse and the Barbara Richardson, the head of the election law committee, were named as the deep state. Robert Griffin, sorry. And then it went on to sort of say, you got to do something about this, and this picture of guys with guns. Now, I'm sure the Republican Party is not endorsing that, but there's just a lot of tough stuff out there. And how do we pull it back so that we're all Americans and we're all, this, somehow we have to figure this out, and I don't know what the answer is. Maybe you have some other insights.
Well, I mean, there's a overarching issue when you hear political discussion beginning with insults, like President Trump statement rejected immediately. But we also do it by acknowledging that there's some problems as you've done and addressing them. I mean, each one of us that have participated in the political arena as elected officials, we're aware of fraud that's happened out there. You know, I used to represent New Boston, and some people came to me and said, you know, Bill, we've owned our house for 20, 22 years now, and we still get literature sent by the Democratic Party to prior residents. So we went and looked, and they've been voting out of our address since we bought the house 22 years ago. And not only are they voting out of our address, but even though they've moved to London, England, not only are they voting out of our address, but children of theirs who were born after they lived here are voting out of our address. And we actually went and looked at it. One of the children joined the Labour Party in England, but he was still voting in New Hampshire elections. We have to address situations like that. When I first ran again in 2005, I sat out, as we all do, holding signs out in front of the poll in Boston, and every 20 minutes, a car would pull up with Montana tags on it. People would get out, walk in, vote, come back out again. That's a concern. That same election in the little town of Temple, which is right next to the Massachusetts border, same day registration increased its voter rolls by about 40%. And people are saying, we've never seen these people. What we've seen is an effort over time to liberalize voting laws so that we're defining away fraud. But from the layman's point of view, when you have non-citizens coming in and voting, that's fraud.
What you just said concerns me a great deal. I think the first question I want to ask is, do you think that voter confidence in New Hampshire is waning? Do you think that we have a problem with voter confidence in New Hampshire?
I think it's strong but waning. You know, part of it is because of national rhetoric, and national rhetoric has greater foundation for concern than here. I'm not someone who thinks that the 2020 election was decided by fraud, but there's certainly an indication of shenanigans that go beyond what is to be expected and translates to New Hampshire. I think it's good that the message goes out that the elections here are being held in a fairly honest manner, but I think we can do better.
Okay, and in that spirit, when you say that 40 people come across the state border into Temple and register to vote,
40%.
40%.
Increase the voter roll.
That may be more than 40 people. If there are more than 100 people in Temple, let's not do the math, but let's think about what you're saying. If you're saying that happened, based on my experience of working at the polls in Bow, New Hampshire during the election, those people are identifiable. You can come here and you can hold those pieces of paper. You can prosecute those people for fraudulently participating in a New Hampshire election. And yet you speak about that as this is something that happened and nothing happens. You know, we have to stop these things that you are claiming, and other people have made these claims too. But no one has made the proof absolutely, surely presented. And I think that's one of the things that we've got to be very careful in making sure that we have that proof and that we can identify the individuals that have misused our electoral system. Because that's how we're going to stop the people's confidence from waning. That's how we're going to build people's confidence that we are showing that these people have been caught or that they are not being allowed to cast votes illegally in our system. So my hope is that you as the representative of the Republican Party and Ray Buckley as the representative of the Democratic Party can come to us with issues or with suggestions that you both have agreed upon that will enable us, a bipartisan panel, to incorporate in our deliberations when we come to writing the report. Because that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make the best recommendations to the Secretary of State and to the citizens of New Hampshire in putting together what we hope will be suggestions that will build confidence and not erode confidence. So if we have that kind of cooperation from the two-party system, I think that's the kind of leadership that we've heard talked about from Doug Teschner and others that needs to grab this issue or these concerns by the horns and wrestle them to the mat and provide solutions that will turn our attitudes from skepticism and doubt to believe that we are actually making the changes that are going to improve the voting process and improve voter turnout and voter participation. That's what I hope that we can accomplish through the committee, the special committee that is meeting here and taking these testimonies.
Seeking a reaction of confidence when it's unwarranted, just in asking us to go forward that message, is just going to produce cynicism.
I think we're all in a stage. We need to emerge out of that.
I disagree with you that instances of fraud haven't been brought forward. They have been brought forward, many instances, and they weren't reacted to. And I perhaps should re-emphasize something I said before, which is that as time has gone on, what a layperson would view, for want of a better term, as fraud, as wrong, as inappropriate. People coming into the state and claiming just domiciliary status and then leaving almost immediately. While it's legal, there's nothing to report down there in fraud, given the court cases. Most people would recognize that's inappropriate. And so that's what we're seeking in a way of reform. When we have Martha Fuller Clark having 5 campaign workers vote out of her house, and then those campaign workers go away, then that's inappropriate. Now, nothing illegal about that. They can be a domiciliary by just showing physical presence and not a demonstrated intention of leaving the state. But that's not who should be participating. 49 other states, only New Hampshire doesn't require that you be a resident of the state to vote in New Hampshire elections. People assume it does, and to the extent it diverges from that, they view that as wrong, inappropriate, call it fraud, call it wrong, whatever.
To agree with my colleague, obviously there is some fraud, and it happens. It's not 100%. But you've made a lot of allegations about like the people in New Boston. Was that given to the Attorney General?
Yes.
And the Attorney General so didn't rule on it? Or are you saying that the process we have?
Sent me a letter saying where else are they going to vote from?
So are you saying that? Well, I guess my question is, do we need a better process to deal with complaints? Are you saying that?
Sure. I mean, ideally,
the Attorney General process is not satisfactory?
Sure. I mean, I sympathize entirely with the plight of the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. The Secretary of State has a lot to do, registering corporations, all kinds of stuff to do. Voting laws are just one aspect of it. The Attorney General is prosecuting very serious crimes, and if someone says, "Oh, here's an instance of voting fraud, would like to spend a lot of resources," they're going to make a choice, as well they should. We should do what perhaps other states have done, just set up a separate office to investigate and prosecute voter fraud.
Do you believe that the 2020 election was accurately decided?
What difference does it make what I believe? Why would you ask me that? What difference? What does it make? I mean, I'm not deciding. It's Joe Biden as president. He had a bunch of electors, a sufficient number voted as president.
You spoke in your recommendation about citizenship. Do you believe that the current standards to prove citizenship when you register to vote are not adequate?
Sure, to the extent that you can show up and you can be Vladimir Putin, but sign an affidavit of citizenship, and it has to be taken at face value, and just vote. You think that's adequate?
In an honest society, yes.
In an honest society, we don't need criminal courts. In an honest society, we don't need criminal laws.
That would be heaven.
But in an honest society,
New Hampshire was closer to that decades ago.
in an honest society, we don't need the EPA. Wait a minute.
Just following up on the age-old debate, and it's almost age-old because I've been hearing about it for about 35 or 40 years. This residency, citizen, and domicile and inhabitant stuff that got freely scattered around among the provisions of our Constitution to the everlasting discredit of whoever did that to us, and we've been playing with it ever since. Does that, and it's just a question because I'm not familiar with those CACRs you talked about sufficiently to know the answer. Did they try to put that question to rest finally?
It is an attempt to. We've actually vetted it. It's language that was drafted by me, but drafted by former Chief Justice Bob Mann. I mean, we vetted it nationally and said, does this work? They said, in the States, this works.
Thank you. I would like to just echo what Chairman Swett said. Brilliant idea. Would you and Mr. Buckley be willing to sit down and see if there's things that you could agree on? I realize there's many things you won't agree on, but if there were specific things you would agree on, that would be really, could be really helpful to this committee.
Well,
Would you be willing to do that?
We just did. I think moderator training is a good idea.
Well, maybe there's other things that you two would be willing to sit down and have a conversation. Would that be
I'll
possible?
send him over my list, and I'm sure he'll read this.
We'd like a picture of the two of you sitting together.
Mr. Buckley, would you be willing to do that?
Our office door is open to any remote.
I'll look forward to, I understand it may be a short list, but I would look forward to anything that you would be willing to offer us. Thank you.
I think Chairman Buckley's been avoiding me over the years because back when I was running for rep, he had robocall into my primary, telling folks that I'd joined the Democrat Party. Ended up getting fined $5,000 for that. So I think he's been a little bit irritated at me ever since then. So I'm not sure how well that will
I think we can move on from that. It's very entertaining, but probably irrelevant conversation about your relationship with Mr. Buckley. Any further questions?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony again, Mr. Speaker. You know I have a very high regard for you, so what I'm about to ask do not reflect my concerns at all, but we have had people testify before this committee in the past, giving examples of voter concerns as you have today. Similar concerns like people voting from addresses that they don't live at, vehicles coming in from other states, and subsequent testimony, and quite a bit of subsequent testimony, has targeted those people and claimed that they're simply gaslighting, and that the Secretary of State and this committee should be shut down because all we're doing is giving a platform for those who have concerns that are illegitimate concerns. And I would respectfully ask, what would you suggest how we reply to those people? Because now going forward, they will also be referring to your testimony as being gaslighting.
Yeah, so this, I was asked an earlier question, how do we come together? And it's very difficult to come together when there are people out there saying to one side or the other, stop talking. We don't want to hear it. So I applaud you and your commission, Secretary of State, for listening. It's very important to listen. I said to somebody earlier that several cycles in my party on the party platform committee, which always tends to be a source of some dispute. And I found what works best is to go around and reach out to people and get them into hearings like this. As long as they think they're being listened to make people think that the process is open and transparent, because it's open and transparent.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
All right, we are going to take a 5-minute break. All right, this is the public comment section. We have 20 people signed up. We have 90 minutes. And that leads me to be a genius. Well, it was back there. When we get done, if we still have time, we'll let you speak to it. I believe 4 minutes allow everybody to speak. So if people can try to keep their remarks to 4 minutes, we'll get through this and we'll be done at 8:30 and everybody will have a chance. The first speaker, and we're going to do it in the order of sign-up, is Mackenzie St. Germain of Hampshire.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, members of the committee. My name is Mackenzie St. Germain, and I'm here representing the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights, which is a nonpartisan coalition focused on ensuring a healthy democracy through accessible and well-run elections. We advocate for voter enfranchisement, election security and modernization, and removing barriers to access for all voters. I spoke before the committee back in May about how we can strengthen voter confidence in New Hampshire through improvements to our election systems. I'll be sharing the details of NHCVR's platform of election improvements today, which you all have in front of you. But first, I did want to start by acknowledging the potential risk to our democracy and giving a platform to the baseless voter fraud conspiracy theories that have been shared before this committee in the past meetings, including today. Every time those claims are shared as facts, it directly threatens voters' confidence in our elections and undermines the committee's stated goal to increase voter confidence in New Hampshire. NHCVR has put together a platform of potential election improvements made up of policies that will strengthen voter confidence. Some of these recommendations are policies that can be implemented by the Secretary of State's authority, and some require legislative action. These recommendations include administrative improvements that assist voters in understanding how to vote and support local election officials, access improvements that create additional opportunities for voters to register and access the registration and voter information, and post-election improvements that will ensure accurate post-election data and trust in our elections. First, there are a number of administrative improvements that can be made by the Secretary of State's office to improve our elections for Granite Staters. These changes include things like dedicated resources to ensure website accuracy at the state and municipal level, the purchasing of up-to-date equipment like new ballot counting devices to ensure that election day runs smoothly. As has been discussed previously before this committee during the demonstration of the current devices the state uses, the AccuVote machines that New Hampshire towns use are no longer manufactured, which means they're difficult to repair and lack up-to-date security features like two-factor authentication. New devices would help to modernize security at our polling places and also support our election officials in their work at the polls, as current machines often break down and create delays and additional work for those election workers. All of these administrative improvements will also assist voters in understanding how to register to vote in their communities. We can also support our local election officials by expanding the ability to use electronic poll books so that every community who wishes to use them can. And as a state, we can be better at utilizing additional state funding or Help America Vote Act funds for local election officials to support their work and help recruit and train poll workers and volunteers. There are also a number of improvements we can implement to provide additional opportunities for voters to register and access their registration and voting information. These include online voter registration or an election information portal, something which has gained bipartisan support in the state legislature in recent years. Online voter registration would allow voters with New Hampshire IDs to register to vote and update their registration information easily and accurately online. Another potential update in automated voter registration would create increased access to voter registration by allowing opt-out voter registration whenever voters interact with the DMV when they're already providing information that proves their citizenship, age, and domicile. By allowing voters to register earlier and either through an online system or an automated system through the DMV, New Hampshire would minimize data entry errors due to poor handwriting or simple misreading of the registration form, while also minimizing the number of people who register same day and potentially use an affidavit to vote. And because it takes place at the DMV, where proof of identity is essential to any of these services, security would be maintained. Both of these things strengthen voter confidence by securely and efficiently increasing access to voter registration and also lessen the workload for our local election officials. In addition, multilingual voter registration and voting documents, at a minimum provided in Spanish to begin, would also ensure that more voters have access to voting materials in their own native language.
1 minute.
Okay. And could be implemented by the Secretary of State's office. Another improvement would be to expand access to voting and limit barriers for all Granite State voters, would be to expand absentee voting, to codify the Attorney General and Governor's orders from the 2020 election, to allow those that have a concern about contracting or spreading a serious illness to vote by absentee. Finally, after our elections are completed every 2 years, there are post-election improvements we can make to strengthen trust in our systems by ensuring accurate data in voter rolls, by joining the Electronic Registration Information Center, Eyring, we've heard about today. New Hampshire could have clean and accurate voter rolls after every election instead of every 10 years. Maine, Vermont, and Florida are just a few of the 31 states that are part of Eyring, with Massachusetts joining this year, meaning our voter rolls will be updated to remove those voters who move and register in those other states. There's also been a lot of discussion at these meetings about post-election audits. We support implementing a robust, nonpartisan post-election audit system that would ensure there's transparency and trust around our election results. We also want to emphasize our belief that the discourse and recommendations of this committee should be based in facts and not give a platform to the dangerous rhetoric of voter fraud conspiracy theories, as well as give serious consideration to who the committee is serving. The recommendations I've outlined today, if implemented, will help New Hampshire by increasing participation, as well as transparency and modernization of our elections. And we're happy to provide further details of any of these proposals as a follow-up, in addition to having additional speakers speak to these policies in upcoming meetings. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. That was the longest 4 minutes in history. Other people, 4 minutes. Valeria Ortiz Cuevas.
Good evening. My name is Valeria Ortiz Cuevas, and I've been a resident here in Nashua for almost 10 years. I'll be a senior this fall at Nashua High School South and a future graduate of the class of 2023. Over the years, I have dedicated a lot of my time volunteering in my community and Zink Youth. For those who may be unfamiliar, Zink Youth is a nonprofit organization dedicated to teaching students in Latin America English and encouraging a bilingual education. I have had the opportunity to volunteer at events through Granite State Organizing Project and United Way, where I've become more informed on the various organizations committed to helping people throughout the state of New Hampshire. At the soup kitchen, I've assisted the elderly and handicapped, as well as made countless of lunch bags for the homeless and families in need. I've also been given the opportunity to assist with the clinic, where I've been able to inform others about incoming events, volunteer opportunities, and inform them on the support the state is providing. I've made numerous friendships and great memories, and I've become more conscious of the struggles people in the community are facing and the hardships life brings as we get older. One of these issues is increasing voter turnout and promoting voter confidence and civic engagement among younger voters. There are multiple things that we can do to ensure this happens. One way would be to implement the use of new ballot counting machines so that old ones stop breaking down and causing delays on the election days. Also, ensuring the Secretary of State's office is updated polling hour and location information on the website so the voters, especially young ones voting for the first time, have the most accurate information available for them. Thank you for your time and for having me speak here today. I'd like to end with this quote I found quite powerful. When young people discover they can be when young people discover they can be agents of change, wonderful things happen. They start to serve in their neighborhoods, learn about public issues, and create innovative solutions to tough public challenges, and eventually become the voters, community project builders, and leaders of the communities in the nation. This quote is by Alma Powell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emily Marcato.
Hello, my name is Emily. I'm 18 years old, born and raised in Nashua, New Hampshire, currently working for the Nashua School District, and am a proud graduate of one of the Nashua schools. I am a member of the Granite State Organizing Project, and I'm here today to talk about some challenges that young people face when trying to take part in elections here in New Hampshire. I would love to see the spread of misinformation surrounding our elections in New Hampshire and election systems here come to a stop. One example of this is when people talk about there being widespread voter fraud in New Hampshire, or people coming in to vote from out of state, both of which aren't true, but have led proposed restrictions on voting. This misinformation has a negative impact on young people, such as myself taking part in elections. This will be my first year voting, and I'm happy to take part in this election, and would hope many other people do so. I would like to see the Secretary of State's and town's website be more modernized so that it's easy to understand and has accessible guidelines on how to register to vote, as well as making online registration available, as I know many young voters or potential voters would welcome that, and it will make democracy more accessible. I believe that these basic hurdles prevent young people from staying informed and taking part of our democracy, but believe in these practical solutions to make things better. I thank you very much for your time and look forward to seeing the committee hopefully making these suggestions to everyone. And thank you.
Thank you for your patience. Senator Melanie LeVay.
Good evening to all the committee members and Secretary Scanlon. It's a pleasure to be here before you. My name is Melanie LeVay, and I'm the former chair of the Senate Election Law Committee, and this issue is near and dear to my heart. While according to a recent UNH poll, in which it has shown a vast majority of Granite State voters have confidence in our elections, we should always be striving to do better. When I was leading the Election Law Committee, I worked tirelessly to improve voter confidence in our elections by working to implement common sense election modernization reforms that will undoubtedly improve voter confidence. The committee has made clear in previous meetings that its charge is to look forward at ways we can improve voter confidence. Looking forward, making sure that every voter has the opportunity to register and vote, but also that publicly available voter information is accurate, will be critical. Election modernization is often a clear cross point of these two important goals. Looking at two key reforms, automated and online voter registration. First, I think it's important to know that supervisors of the checklist will always have the final say in adding someone to the checklist. That just gives voters more options to register or update their registration. This matters for two very important reasons having to do with voter confidence. One is that it allows the checklist to be more up to date, and secondly, it minimizes handwriting errors on the checklist. As people look through voter checklists and complete their own audits, this will help to minimize concerns. Another important election confidence tool is the Electronic Registration Information Center. You've heard of Eyring, and you've spoken of it earlier. Eyring is a sophisticated database that compares voter rolls from participating states and removes voters from the New Hampshire voter rolls that have moved out of New Hampshire, within New Hampshire, have died, and are registered somewhere else. It will surprise no one here that the two largest exodus of people out of New Hampshire is to Massachusetts and to Florida. Both of these states are Eyring member states. Eyring will improve voter confidence because it keeps our voter list accurate and very quickly helps catch the extremely rare cases of voter fraud. Membership in Eyring is overwhelmingly bipartisan. For example, it is heralded by Governor DeSantis of Florida and Governor Murphy of New Jersey. With each of these reforms, New Hampshire would be joining dozens of other states that have already implemented them. We know from other states these reforms are affordable and common sense. We also know that the Secretary of State's office has over $10 million in Help America Vote funds that could be used to help subsidize the cost. The legislature and the Secretary of State should release these funds so that they can be used for these important and impactful programs, which is their intended purpose. If we're truly serious about improving voter confidence, I would strongly advise this committee to look into all of these affordable, common sense reforms that New Hampshire should implement as soon as possible. Now, I also have some other remarks, because I have a few minutes long, but longer, I take it. Do I have 1 minute?
30 seconds.
You can have a minute.
Okay, I'll leave out the Eyring stuff. I just want to talk about, real quick, the fact that we have clean elections and there is a great deal of integrity in our elections. We have checkpoints at many states of this process. Voters have to register to get on the voter checklist. When they vote, they have to turn in their card or, check onto the checklist. And if they've been checked off, somebody else with their name or somebody else who is not on the checklist cannot be added. So there's checks and balances. At the end of the night, the list on the supervisor of the checklist, list of voters, should match what came out of the machine. And sometimes they don't match perfectly, but they are pretty darn close. There are cases of fraud, very small, and they have been researched. I got stacks of papers from the Secretary of State's office that show these are the investigations, and we found 3 that are still in question. It took months to do that. With Eric, we can do that in probably a week. We will know who is on that list. So I want to thank you for your time and thank you all for your service. I hope that we're able to find some solutions working together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, if I have one small favor.
Yes.
I would appreciate if you could just email me the date of the poll that you were making reference to. We had Andy Smith testify. I don't recall him saying that, so I'd like to see the poll that you're making reference to.
Certainly.
Just send it to me. I'll share it.
I
Thank
will
you.
do that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Representative Laura Telesky.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here today. I am Laura Tversky of Nashua. I'm a state representative in Nashua's Ward 8. But I also was a selectman from 2017 to 19. I have worked a number of elections, and I also have registered voters on election day. I believe voter confidence is rooted in an easy, safe, and accessible polling place. The voting place in my own ward is a very small school cafeteria, and the requirements for the number of booths per registered voters is a challenge for the space. Even more so since COVID. The area is crowded, lines develop, and election workers are challenged to perform their tasks. Crowded is good, but it does not have to be this way. I would like to see improvements that would reduce the number of people on election day that must go through that space. Some ideas are no excuse absentee voting. We saw that it worked well in 2020 and voters took advantage of it. Today it feels a little bit like rolling the dice. Will I wait until election day with a fever and not be able to vote? There are easy and safe ways to ensure everyone can vote, and this will also help with the volume of people passing through on election day. Additionally, pre-processing of ballots worked great. I have worked many elections where we were so busy throughout the day, we couldn't even begin processing absentee ballots until after the polls closed, and we've already heard about how exhausting the whole process is after being there since 5 in the morning. Another option would be vote by mail or early voting. As a poll worker, I would arrive at 5 a.m., and by 5:30 there would be a line outside the door waiting to enter at 6. I have talked to these people, and many have long commutes, and they wouldn't know if they would make it back in time before the polls closed. Many have an early start to work, commitments with childcare, or they go on to a second job. Our families are doing their best to make ends meet, and we should be making it easier for them to vote. Early voting and no excuse absentee voting do just that. Online voter registration. The reality is working families are busy, and for many, registering to vote is unfortunately not at the top of their list when moving to a new community. The choice is often to find time to go down to City Hall, potentially leaving work, or stand in line the day of an election to register. I believe same-day voter registration is great for this very reason. And when I registered voters, people would show up with their documents. New citizens would have their paperwork, and it works well. But there should be more options because, again, lines and congestion and people potentially waiting a significant amount of time could limit and take away someone's voice. Being able to get as many people registered in advance can only improve participation while relieving pressure on our tax poll workers. We need to support our election officials, and efforts at modernization will work towards improving voter confidence and support those who work so hard to run a successful and safe and secure election. Finally, I would like to address the danger in not calling out mistruths and conspiracies or correcting outright lies. To me, it is shocking that a group of people have been allowed to hijack our election system and sow distrust without any pushback by those who oversee our elections. Not challenging these statements undermines the work and the reasons why this committee was established in the first place. Efforts to suppress the vote and limiting the opportunity to vote weakens voter confidence. We need to increase participation, not make it more difficult. I hope this committee brings recommendations for voter trust through increased participation, voter education, and access. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tina Cato.
Secretary Scanlon, committee, thanks for putting this together today to give people a voice and information that they can take back, talk to their constituents, or tell their friends and family. Tim.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right, sir.
Can't read your writing.
I'm Tim Cato from Raymond, New Hampshire. I just wanted to say that, especially this gentleman who came from the North Country, you all drove here today, everybody drove here, or probably most of us drove here, and if we're honest, if everyone in here is honest, you would all agree that you probably broke a speeding law on the way over here or something like that. I think everybody in here probably's got a little foot, we all live in New Hampshire. Just because you didn't get caught doesn't mean you weren't speeding. And just because people didn't get caught doesn't mean there wasn't voter fraud. You can easily jump on the Heritage Foundation and look up past convictions of election and voter fraud in the state of New Hampshire. And you can see where the voter fraud occurred, when they were convicted. You can see names were redacted by previous Secretary Gardner. And I just wanted to say that just because people weren't caught doesn't mean you don't have a problem to face.
What was that website you referred to?
The Heritage Foundation.
I got it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Regina Barnes.
Thank you, committee, for having this, and Secretary of State, thank you for being here today. This is not the first time I spoke to this committee. I was here back, I believe it was May or June, and I talked about how I was a selectman for 6 years, and I stood at the poll all day for 6 years, and how things weren't quite right. And one of the biggest things that we could do is all get actively involved on election day if we're currently not. And I think that should definitely come from this committee to encourage all towns and cities to get new people to help out at the polls. But what I do want to talk about, and I've been listening to everyone's comments, and they're all great, and a lot of them have been, we should do this is going to get more people to the polls, this is going to turn people away from the polls, not have confidence. But what no one seems to be talking about is that we are doing things that are not authorized by the state constitution of New Hampshire when it comes to voting laws. There is one article in the Bill of Rights, it's Article 11, and the only reference it makes to who is authorized to vote in this state is if you are an inhabitant. It does not mention the word resident at all. That was made up by the legislator, I believe it was in the early 70s. Now, I know some of you are former legislators, and I looked at your resumes on the committee website, and none of you are currently elected. Please let me know if I'm wrong on that. But I did see that the co-chair, Bradford Cook, was a current attorney, and as a two-term selectman, I took the oath to the state of New Hampshire Constitution, to the U.S. Constitution twice. And my thought has always been, since I'm currently not elected on the board anymore, when does that oath expire? In my view, it doesn't. So, as you have one current attorney on the board, this is going to be specifically addressed to him since he is someone who has taken the oath. But I really want the whole committee to think about what I'm going to say. So like I said, we've been talking about partisan politics. The Democrats think one way, the Republicans think another way. That's the way it's always been. But what we need to talk about and start talking about more is the state constitution and Article 11. And one of the ways that we can remedy this situation is by the committee making recommendations to the Secretary of State, I assume, since you formed the committee, who is in charge of not making the laws, that we know is done by the legislator, but making sure those laws are followed through. And the problem with the laws are they are unconstitutional. They were never authorized by the people of New Hampshire, the state citizens of New Hampshire. So with that all said, I am going to serve today, and I do have copies for the committee, a notice of trespass to Attorney Bradford Cook for an infringement on my constitutional rights as a state senator, as a state citizen of New Hampshire. I am going to read this for the record. This is a public notice of trespass on my constitutional rights. It is intended to inform you as a local public servant, official of the Ballot Law Commission, and member of the New Hampshire Bar. You knew or should have known that the use of electronic ballot counting devices was illegal. On February 24th of 2022, a remonstrance was filed with the Secretary of State, the Governor, and House of Representatives. The legislature has no constitutional authority to amend how votes must be counted without the consent of the inhabitants. New Hampshire RSA 65640 was passed in 1979 under the color of law to utilize electronic ballot counting devices on a temporary basis, and was initiated in violation of Part 2, Article 32 of the state constitution. Therefore, any use of ballot counting devices under the color of law by any city, town, or political subdivision are unauthorized. Subsequent to all the above, the New Hampshire Special Committee on Voter Confidence received evidence of election discrepancies regarding ballot counting devices used throughout the state during the 2020 general election. Testimony was given at the committee's May 13th, 24th, June 7th, 12th, and 26th meeting. Mr. Bradford Cook, as an attorney in the state of New Hampshire, you have violated your oath of office by not discontinuing the use of electronic ballot counting devices for all elections in the state of New Hampshire. And I can, oh, and I also have Michael Bean from Rye. He's a state citizen. He has a complaint in here as well.
Good evening, committee, Secretary of State. Thank you for letting me speak tonight. I wanted to just address, first of all, the question that was raised on the whole conspiracy theory and no election evidence. I want this committee to know that in January of 2022, we presented and actually mailed affidavits of votes that were cast through our canvassing process that were cast by citizens that did not live at the residence, were commercial addresses, and a multitude of issues. This was sent to the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the entire Election Law Committee. I did not get a single response from any of those guys. The second thing is that I would like to ask you guys, I was here back in July, actually June. I prepared for you a statewide audit. It was actually done by our team of all of the performance of every voting machine in the state, and it showed significant anomalies in performance. Not a single question. I provided you Windham video evidence of the tapes, the machines being wiped, along with the ballot count evidence at the end where the hand count after the machines were reset was closer, in fact, to the results of the reset machines versus the day of the election. On top of that, not a single machine matched to begin with. The final thing is that I wanted to also tell you I presented 1,000 examples to you of homeowners that sold their homes but had votes cast in their names in the state of New Hampshire. And could I ask this committee what you did with those 1,000 examples that were given to you.
We received them.
And was any action taken?
We haven't issued our report yet, so we are in the process of considering all testimony and information that we have received. So it has yet to be determined.
I truly appreciate that, but it speaks to the whole issue of why we have such a gap and how people feel about our elections. We're told, we just had this lady stand up here and tell you that it's a conspiracy theory. I'm presenting you today 15,000 examples. Here, I'll give it to the Secretary of State. You lucky devil. We were able to leverage some support from a national organization, and you have 15,500 examples between the year 2018 and 2020 of people who permanently moved from their residence, but yet cast votes from those homes. Now, whether they did it or somebody else, we don't know. But I can tell you that that is a smoking gun to the people in this room who believe we have an election process. And any time that someone tells us that this is a perfect election process in New Hampshire and everything's going great, it incensed us and makes us feel completely disenfranchised. And speaking of disenfranchisement, there are 15,000 people whose votes were canceled out if those are all people that should not have voted. Right. So we need you to hear us. We need to have an overhaul of our election process. It's absolutely unbounded as far as closed loop process.
1 minute.
I don't need to talk any further. I appreciate the time, but I hope you get the passion. Not a single member of this committee asked me a question on the citizens audit done by the New Hampshire Voter Integrity Group. Not a single question. And yet there was a mountain of evidence. And we are looking forward to working with you and helping this process. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Secretary of State. I want to comment a bit on some of the observations that were made today regarding both training of election officials and on the absentee ballots. When we vote in person on the elections, there's a good chain of custody on the ballot. Ballots handed to us, we're observed, we go to the polling booth, we make our decisions, we put it in the machine, and we know that that ballot was delivered by the person who was checked off on the checklist. When we go to absentee balloting, that chain of custody is lost. And I'm concerned right now about some language I've seen in the City of Nashua's website about absentee voting. The black letter law absentee ballot is very clear. If you're unable to vote there in person by reason of physical disability, then you can get an absentee ballot. And we relaxed that last time with the COVID situation because of the concern of COVID and public exposure. That's been removed now. Although on the Nashua's website, which I printed out today, it states very clearly that you can qualify with a physical disability if you were a voter who, due to their own health circumstances, I'm afraid of COVID, limit public exposure to the day-to-day life as a preventative measure. So if I'm afraid of COVID and I wear a mask to prevent exposure, it seems to me that that's sufficiently qualified to get an absentee ballot in the city of Nashua. So I'd like to talk a bit about training on the election law, and I hope that this statement I've made was I've given to Secretary Scanlon for him to review at his convenience to see if the city of Nashua is complying with state law, and that whatever his decision is, we can make it clear to the other jurisdictions in their training just what is required for an absentee ballot and what is not approved to get an absentee ballot. Thank you, members.
Thank you very much. hold on to it.
My name is Henry Clementovich. I'm a senior staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union of New Hampshire. I wrote on the form that I live in Portsmouth, which is true, but I grew up in Nashua. I sent you all my written testimony, which I'm not going to repeat, except to say that as of April 8th, 2022, the Attorney General's office had confirmed that out of the 1 million votes that were cast in the 2020 September and November elections, they had 0 cases that they've brought of voter fraud and only 5 open investigations, 17 closed investigations that did not result in the bringing of charges. I also just wanted to read to you a quote from the trial court in the SB3 case, which I was a part of, wherein the trial court said, quote, the reality is that voter fraud is virtually non-existent in the state. The fact that the state conceded at trial. So, we know from the courts, we know from the Attorney General's office, we know from the Secretary of State and the Governor that very few people in New Hampshire commit voter fraud. In 2020, that number was apparently 0. In June, UNH conducted a poll that revealed that 84% of Granite Staters said they were very or somewhat confident in the way elections are conducted in the state. I think actually to get 84% of Granite Staters to agree on anything is kind of tremendous. So my view is that there isn't a voter confidence problem in New Hampshire, that actually confidence in New Hampshire elections are quite high. Nonetheless, there's just one thing I wanted to talk about tonight, and that's the issue of partisan gerrymandering, which I think actually really does reflect poorly on the state and does lead people to feel disenfranchised. A poll conducted in February of 2022 showed that 80% of respondents believes that the redistricting plans that had been proposed in the general court were unfair. We know that the governor vetoed the congressional map for being an unfair partisan gerrymander designed to give Democrats 1 congressional district and Republicans 1 congressional district. But he signed 3 other plans. He signed one for the State Senate, Executive Council, and State House. And those plans are all also being challenged in court as violating the state constitution. When politicians draw their districts in a way designed to have a dominant outcome in the general election that's predetermined, it takes power away from the voters, and it makes people feel like, why should I even bother voting if I know that because the way these districts were just redrawn, they're going to elect a Democrat or they're going to elect a Republican. So my suggestion to this committee is that they should include a recommendation either to have an independent panel of people draw the plans or to just instruct the general court to stop drawing plans for unfair partisan advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joe Torelli.
Thank you for having this forum and giving us a chance to speak. I have my blue book that was handed to me by Secretary Scanlon. In very small letters, sadly, it says, securing to the citizens their rights of suffrage. And I'm thinking, that's poetry. And so I did a search for that, and I came up with this document, which is the 1814 version of this. Okay? So I did a little research. I'm losing my props. And in the 12 pages, it's pretty amazing the detail that is included in 12 pages, as long as you can read through the long S's that look like F's, which I'm pretty good at. I mean, I can read Cyrillic pretty well, which you'll hear in a moment. I am a constitutional libertarian. I am undeclared because I loathe the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, sometimes one more than the other. I'm saddened that the representatives from both parties have decided to leave because this is really important. This is an important meeting, as all have been in the series. I was at the one at the Archives building where the Salesman of the Year brought the new machine, but then I had to leave quickly. And I was saddened at the lack of really pertinent questions that needed to be made to that man about the integrity of that device. And that's what we're supposed to be looking at. So we bought a house. We moved from Windham to Hampton. We closed on the house And it was unlike one of the previous examples where people may have moved and didn't get a chance to register. The very first thing we did after we closed the pens was to walk 2 buildings to the town hall to change our residency, our domicile from Windham to Hampton on that day. I had no idea what else I should have done when I was at the town clerk's office doing that. We had the closing documents. It's missing a page, and so in my career, I've been a problem solver and a troubleshooter. I was with NBC News for 13 years, traveling to really horrible places so you could watch television and watch Muammar Gaddafi talking to Tom Brokaw. And you could watch the elections in East Germany when there was in East Germany. I've been to 76 countries, and I see what happens when there's either no voting or really bad voting and bad processes associated with that. So imagine my shock that earlier this year, when I punched in my address, I ended up with 6 people that voted for my house. Only 2 of whom were registered to vote from that house. I have sworn affidavits that I will provide because I would like the folder that I have here, the contents of the folder with a little master list. I would love for that to be entered into the record. So there's 4 affidavits from the 4 other people. I've got the photographs of the checklist from November 8th or November 3rd of 2020 showing the other 4 people. Plus I have the one that shows my wife and myself because that's the only accurate one. Imagine my horror on February 7th, looking at the February 7th checklist of this year before the town meeting, the same 4 people. February of 2022, those people are still registered. So I have proof that they voted. I have the checklist with the line that says AV next to it. And I'm just really livid that that's even something I have to come here to talk about. We also did a 91A for all of the machine records. And I have presented and had conversations with Richard Tracy and Miles Matson, who are the DOJ representatives. That's me telling that I should probably stop. They are DOJ representatives specific to being able to prosecute at the DOJ. There's an election group, so there is one. So let's do it. So I'm going to hand this off. I have more to say, but I think I've done enough. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
Paul Thompson.
Let me get them in order.
I'm an engineer. I've been an engineer for 40 years. Mostly complex systems, developing them, putting them together, implementing and so on. My advice is, and has been great advice over the past 40 years, has been to simplify. Simplification is what makes systems work, make complex systems work and work well. My thought into this is to develop a system that will do real-time verification of a citizen. I can't for the life of me understand why that is impossible. We've got databases all over the state, whether it's taxpayer, D&V as we've talked about, or what else? Utilities, so on and so forth, and also to tap into the Eyring system as well. But I think to start with that, and then eventually you'd be able to use that system to verify the voter rolls on a fairly regular basis. I think it should be the state of New Hampshire's database. It should be maintained by us. It should be developed by us. I think it's very possible. I was once told from an employee at Barnes & Noble that they sell more technical books in Nashua, New Hampshire than the West Coast. That's how much resources is available. So, can it happen? Can we do it? Yes, we can. And that's really all I got to say. Hope it's a positive swing.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, are you at all concerned about privacy concerns? Because every time we start talking about, getting people's data online and we start hearing a lot of that sort of thing, so.
Well, again, I think the key there is that it needs to be developed by us, the state of New Hampshire. And, you know, you only need read-only access into the databases that are available. And I think that's available. There's something that goes on today that is the computer systems that interact with each other in commerce, you know, Amazon, Walmart, and ordering systems and build, you know, ordering products and things that go on between companies is working. It's working really well without privacy concerns. There's technology today that supersedes that. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jane Mercer. Red Mayor.
Good evening. My name is Fred Mayer. I live in Hudson, New Hampshire, and I work in Nashua, New Hampshire. I've lived in Hudson with my wife since 1987, and I've been regularly voting in Hudson since 1988. I wanted to speak in part to the issue of the vote tabulators, the vote machines, because I did hear the committee ask for the two representatives of the two state parties what their position was on those machines. I speak solely for myself as a resident of Hudson, and I want to say that in Hudson, we actually had a vote. There was a warrant article, and the voters of Hudson quite resoundingly defeated the warrant article that would have outlawed our vote tabulators. And it's also my understanding that a number of communities also had votes with similar results. So to respect democracy, I think that the cities and towns of the state of New Hampshire should continue to have that choice as to whether or not they will use voting machines. I think it's worth noting that no town or city is compelled to use these machines. I also wanted to mention that beginning in 2020, I started volunteering as a poll observer. And I had a chance to observe in Hudson, Derry, Manchester, and Nashua. And that experience, frankly, gave me great confidence in the election system here in New Hampshire. I developed incredible respect and appreciation for the clerks, the moderators, the workers, the volunteers who put in those incredibly long days, beginning at setting things up at 5 in the morning, and then counting all those votes, allowing people to vote even past 8 o'clock because there are so often lines at 8 o'clock at poll closing times, and those folks in line were quite properly allowed to vote. And then came the very long process of counting those votes. And I think it's unfair and would show an incredible lack of appreciation for all that good work to prevent those folks from having the option of using a vote tabulator, so possibly they can get home, before midnight as opposed to before 3 a.m. I also think that the citizens of the state should be urged, in order to develop voter confidence, to turn off the TVs and get off the internet and go to the polls and watch the work that's being done there, because we have a wonderfully transparent system. In my town of Hudson, on the Facebook, there was an announcement. We're going to test the voting machine. You can come. I was there, and some of my fellow residents of Hudson were there, and it was a very long and tedious process. And I felt sorry for the moderator and the town clerk, because after about 90 minutes, the observers, the folks who were interested, and well, we all gave up, and we went home and did other things, while the moderator and the town clerk continued to test each and every machine to ensure that it would properly work. I also had an opportunity to volunteer. Thank you. I also had the opportunity to volunteer at the recounts. And what I learned there is talk about transparency. We've got a Republican and a Democrat sitting beside. We're looking at the same paper ballots. And Lo and behold, whenever there was a recount, it validated and corroborated the ultimate results of the election and the counts of the machines. We have had some incidents, and we had this wonderful recount procedure that caught those problems, and we were able to address those problems. It's a wonderfully transparent system. I think people should be encouraged to participate in it, and that, I think, ought to lead to greater vote confidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Curtis Register.
Howdy, y'all. I appreciate y'all having me here tonight. Sir, committee members, I appreciate having an open forum session where I can come out here and speak. I apologize for alienating the room here. I know y'all are a big fan of them, but I am not from Massachusetts. I am from North Carolina, but I moved up here about a year ago, and I've had the pleasure of living in your great state for the past year and voting in one of your elections locally, and I gotta say, it's wonderful. I am a prior service Marine, so I'll try to keep the profanity to a minimum, but I don't want to waste too much of everybody's time because it's too late, but I don't have any access to any information that y'all already know. I trust the electoral process. I trust our elected leaders to do what is right to safeguard our democracy. I trust the leadership in this room to make judgment calls that will support the voice of New Hampshire residents. I have heard a lot about feelings. A lot of people have been feeling upset about the election. A lot of people have felt anger and rage. A lot of people have felt that there has been widespread voter fraud. Now, I share some of these feelings. I also have many emotions ranging around the election, as everybody else. But in reality, feelings don't matter. Facts do. And it is a fact the United States and New Hampshire had the safest, most secure election in history recently. It is a fact that there has not been any objective, demonstrable, or adjudicated widespread conspiracy for voter fraud. Feelings don't matter. Feelings should not interfere with legislation. Fact should. Now, I've heard a couple folks come up here and talk about some common sense voter reform, and while we have a safe system, you can always make improvements. There are always ways to make sure we safeguard from cyber attacks, from false or malign characters acting in bad faith to subvert and gain power through nefarious means. And I think those have been fairly well outlined by the New Hampshire campaign for voter rights. I'm not going to go through all of them because y'all know them and y'all got Google. But I think the one that speaks the loudest to me that wasn't on that list is leadership. Because that impacts my voter confidence. I see what my leaders do and I want to emulate them. I would challenge and I would hope that leaders of this great state would have the wherewithal and would unabashedly reject any subversives, that's a fancy word, we'll just say any deviant nature that has been trying to undermine our trust and confidence in you, your trust and confidence in us as voters, and this great state and a great democracy that we have. Belief is not required for truth. Truth is. And I trust you guys to take all the information, make a sound judgment call, and do what's right for the people of New Hampshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony.
I think you're the first person today that mentioned the word trust, but that's sort of the key to the whole thing, isn't it? Something I've been thinking a lot about, and I also wrote about it in my latest column in New Hampshire Business Review. And I think that is a key thing that we really need to grapple with. And we need to think more about what makes up trust, and I appreciate you using that term. Thank you.
Russ.
Thank you for your testimony.
Yes. Good evening. I didn't intend to testify. I thought what I signed in was an attendance sheet. And I was certainly hoping I wasn't going to get a lot of email from you all. I will say I've been a selectman This was quite a while ago. I don't remember the year, but I worked at the polls, and somebody will remember the year. I believe it was Ronald Reagan's re-election. I got to the polls roughly 5:15 to 5:30 in the morning, and I got home at 2:30 the next morning, and I thought, well, you don't want to know what I thought. Anyway, fast forward to approximately 3 years ago, up at the New Hampshire State House, there was a small group that I was listening to, and they were talking about the future of elections. This was, again, at least 3 years ago. We hadn't had any 2020 election. But the concern, especially from some of the rural areas, was getting enough people to work the polls, the age of the people that were available to work the polls, if they wanted to work the polls, and then the amount of compensation that was offered to do all of this. And it brought flashbacks of my 2:30 in the morning after that one. Anyway, that's all I'll comment on. And also, if the process is in place, that there is a follow-up to an affidavit to go out and to check onto something, then really you need a budget to be able to support what you need to do any investigation that's needed in a timely manner. So to some degree, it's a financial situation too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael Beauchesne from Hudson, New Hampshire. I wasn't planning on speaking tonight either, but I just wanted to point out that I did do some desktop canvassing in Hudson after the 2020 election. I had reviewed approximately 700 property sales about a year and a half prior to the 2020 election, and I identified 65 affidavits, and I created affidavits, and those were submitted by one of the previous speakers at the June or July presentation. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. Also, with regards to Eric, there was several previous speakers had mentioned that this is a nonpartisan organization. However, I'd like to point out that there was an interview last week. Kyle Ardwin, he's the Secretary of State of Louisiana, and it's published. He had indicated that they used to use Eric, and they no longer use Eric. And it's mainly because there are eligible voters, but there's also unregistered voters within that. And because of the security questions that they could not answer for him, so he has taken the approach where they no longer use it. Also in that same interview, they were talking about that there was in 2020, there was a Federalist article that stated the Judicial Watch had found 353 U.S. counties had 1.8 million more registered voters than eligible age citizens, voting age citizens. So that's some of the main reasons why that state decided not to use Eric. One last point that I'd like to bring up. One of the previous speakers, Brenda Town, had spoken, and she had submitted a 91A to preserve the evidence of the printing of the invoices on behalf of the New Hampshire Voter Integrity Group. And thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
What was the state that you said doesn't use?
Louisiana.
Louisiana. His name is Kyle Ardwin, Ardwin.
I have one comment. Michael, if you, Brenda, and Joe Torelli could stay afterwards, I'd like to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lady Dunn.
I'll waive my opportunity today and be happy to address you again another day. Oh.
That must be me. Scheidegg? There you go. Good evening. First of all, it's called Election Day. It's not called Election Days. It's not called Election Week. And before you tell me Granny can't get there and somebody's got this, that, and the other thing, it's Election Day. It's worked for 200 years. Well, it's not working very well now, but in any case, there are ways around the problem. As I understand it, we don't vote any more frequently than every 2 years. That gentleman right there can tell me every election day from now until long after I'm dead with dead certainty that that's when it's going to happen, okay? So there's no excuse for me not being able to get my sorry butt, even at my age, down to City Hall and get registered. We're trying to solve a problem for the one person who sleeps in his car, is a college student, and thinks he ought to vote in New Hampshire even though he's from Okefenokee. And we open this Pandora's box, which you see before you tonight, because we have election days or weeks or months the way it's going, and we have mail-in this and mail-in that, which is fraudulent, or the most opportune place to be fraudulent. To be specific, I've tried to be a fraudulent voter. It's a lot of fun. I voted back in the day when you did not need an ID. So I went in and Bob was there, not you, but Bob was there, and he said, "Hi, Carl, come on up." And he said, "Oh, spell that last name for me." I said, "It's right there, okay, I can read upside down." And he crossed me off, and I took my vote. Guy up the street, I've got his name and address. He's a World War II vet. He just passed away. Do me a favor. I'm going to pretend I'm coming in, and I'm going to give you his name and address. Let's look him up and see if I can vote for him. And he went in, and sure enough, he was not on the voter rolls. A win for the system, okay? But if you look at Judicial Watch, and they've been at this for years now, suing states and coming up with 180,000 Chicago registered voter and 200,000 legitimate valid ballots, as far as they could tell, cast. New Hampshire came up pretty good. I'm sorry I don't have the data, but we were one of the ones that had purged a lot, but not all of the dead voters, and you saw what people are looking at, and don't tell me there's no voter fraud. One voter who shouldn't be voting and is voting illegally negates my vote. And my country for 23 years sent me all over Hell's Half Acre defending their right to maybe vote if we were lucky. Okay, in fact, 50 years ago today, I was flying the friendly skies of North Vietnam, and on behalf of my country and theirs to vote. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because the missiles were coming up. Fortunately, as I think it's proved, that they missed me, but I got my master's in electrical engineering. You put the box out there that counts anything or does anything that's got a circuit board in it, and I'll find a way to transmit garbage into it or to get data out of it. Do you realize how many people in the Department of Defense are devoted just to keeping the fingers out of the pie, and we're not always successful? The cyber warfare, you people read about it and stuff. You think these voting machines are impervious to that? And again, we have lots of proof from a lot of people who've looked at this stuff, and none of it has been adjudicated because there's no judge in the world that wants to get involved in this after the election where, well, that's a story for another day. The other voter fraud thing was potential is absentee ballots. And I've had to use those all over the world, but I used one in the last election. And legitimately, I was going to be out of town in another state, so I got it and I followed the course of events. You can do it to Nashua's great credit. On the website, they tell you when they received your request, when they processed it, when they sent it out. So I had this unused ballot in my hand for a couple weeks. Turns out I had to cancel the trip, so I went in and voted. Test number 2. I said to my buddy there, we went through this, and I said, "Hey, listen, I've got a perfectly good ballot at home. It's got not have my name on it. It's there. It's useful." And I said, "How do you know that I haven't voted with that yet?" He says, "Oh, come over here." I forget. I believe it was a yellow mark or whatever. They had gone through the rolls and would have caught me there saying, "Wait a minute. This says you have an absentee ballot. Where is it?" I think I should have had to turn it in at that point. I kept it, obviously I still had it and I voted. That proved that part of the system looks like it was working, but I still had it when I went home, and I had it for the 2 weeks prior to that. I could have done something with that, and there's been ballot harvesting in other states, so I folded it up with a little note on it, and I mailed it back to my city clerk, I don't know, sometime a week after, with a note on it about, I don't think this is a really good idea to have these floating around because the old folks home, which I'm headed for shortly, you know, that could get slipped in there, and there's just, when it's floating around out there in the mail, there's no way. You should not have, I know I'm going to run out of time. Electronic voting machines are just waiting. There's a disaster in the waiting. Because you and I are good, wonderful people, and we can't imagine why we can't deal with trust. Well, there's a very smart politician, I'll remember his name in a minute, said something like, trust but verify? Yeah, maybe. Because we know there's voter fraud. Anybody that sits here and says there isn't any, and there was one in here, you know, it's just not reading the newspapers or whatever. So no electronic voting machines, no voting by mail, other than we have to have a very tightly controlled absentee voting system. It's pretty good, but I think it's still, as I just demonstrated, a lot of ballots floating around out there, and somebody with a little imagination, as has been done in other states, can figure out how to harvest those. The idea that everybody and their brother ought to be able to vote in New Hampshire, you need to be a citizen of the United States and able to prove it, and you need to have a way to prove that you're supposed to be voting, which is why I did my little experiment. It would have been more compelling if I could have voted in the dead person's name. Time? Thank you. We'll do it next time.
Tim Sutton.
Tim Sennett, I live here in Nashua, and I am the moderator for Ward 7 here in Nashua. I'd come here intending, without a real outline, to speak about my experiences and my observations as a moderator. I've held the position for 2 terms now. Prior to that, I was a selectman in Ward 7. And fortunately for me, a lot of discussion was held about moderators tonight. So you kind of outlined it for me. I wanted to start by responding to some of the things that I had heard. A lot of talk was made about qualifying or certifying election officials, in particular moderators, but presumably clerks, selectmen, ballot inspectors as well. It's no secret to anybody in this room that moderators, clerks, and selectmen are elected officials. I can't speak beyond the borders of Nashua, but I know in Nashua we have serious problem with getting people to pursue those roles. I made the choice as a young person. I'm going to buck the average age of 80 by letting you all know that I'm 37 years old. I don't do this for the money. I do it because I appreciate the process. I do it because I believe in the process. My family sacrifices because of my wildly held belief in the process. Sometimes they wish I would just stop. I didn't get to put my 7-year-old son to bed tonight so I could be here with you folks. More often than not, Nashua election officials are determined by a write-in vote. I have a selectman in my ward who got the position by 45 votes. That's not 45 over her competition. That's 45 votes total. For reference, I had 892, so it wasn't a matter of turnout for those positions. It was mentioned earlier by a gentleman who I don't believe is here anymore, that unseasoned moderators such as myself think that they know it all. Geez, I knew I was going to get a little heated tonight, but that one really impressed me. I don't know how long most moderators spend thinking about the election. I know that the filing period for the upcoming primary in September took place in June, and that's how long I've been working on it. I have 8 spots to pay people to be ballot inspectors, and I'm still not full, and we're less than a month away. It's been stated that moderator training should be refreshed every year. Again, I can't speak to the experiences outside of Nashua, but here in Nashua, it is. As an election official, I'm working under my third city clerk now, Mr. Dan Healy. Prior to that, I worked with Ms. Sue Lovering, and prior to that, I worked with somebody who everybody at this table is probably very familiar with, Patricia Pietzi. You know, Patricia Pietzi doesn't stand for any nonsense. We are updated every year. We have mandatory training so that we are able to be paid what little we are paid, and those trainings do come with updated laws and regulations as they're determined by the legislature each year. To say otherwise is patently false, at least here in Nashua. I'm confident in my knowledge, I'm confident in my skill, but I'm always willing to learn more. As I mentioned earlier, the moderator duties that I take on often interfere with my day job for minimal pay. It's not a job I do for the money. And I kind of wrote here, if we're going to take on the task of certifying the moderators who still have to go out into their communities and acquire 15 signatures to get their names on the ballot every 2 years, then I think we should do the same for our state legislature who pays $2 to get on the ballot. We work harder than that to get on the ballot. So if we're certified, I want my next state reps to be certified out to the task. I've heard a lot of boasting tonight about the number of poll watchers that we've hired. We've hired poll watchers. We've hired poll observers who are going to sit in the bleachers or sit behind my ballot inspectors and watch and look for discrepancies. Earlier it was said by somebody else who I won't mention because I'm not going to put them on the spot prior to this meeting, that anybody who has doubts about the system is invited to come work. And I don't mean to serve as a challenger or an observer. Come sign up to work. We need you. We need people at the table checking in voters, learning how to mark the checklist. It's an involved process. It's not easy. Every time we lose people, we have to teach them again, and it falters. We need people who are consistent, and we need people who are passionate about the process. Everybody behind me here who has spoken tonight is clearly passionate about the process. Reach out to your local moderators. You can find them on election day and tell them you want to help. Because just as soon as we're finished with September 13th, we are planning for November 8th. It's coming again, and I'm probably not going to be afforded anybody else to pay. So I need the help. They all need the help.
1 minute.
I'm sorry?
1 minute left.
Thank you. I will warn anybody who is interested in signing up, it is at least a 14-hour day in Nashua. We have the longest polling hours in the state of New Hampshire. We open at 6 a.m., we stay till 8 p.m. That's just for voting. The last state primary I worked, we were there till 1:30 in the morning. So, come ready and bring your coffee. I've also heard it said that people need to be voting where everybody knows where they are. I think that does a disservice to some of the communities here, at least in Nashua. Ward 7 is comprised of a very diverse population. I speak of diversity in terms of cultural, I speak of diversity in terms of economic, and I speak of diversity in the haves versus the have-nots. Ward 7 is an ever-changing populace. We're very transient. We have more rental-occupied properties than we do owner-occupied properties. To say that we're going to know everybody that walks in through those doors every year, and it is every year because we host municipal elections, state elections, and federal elections, is patently false. We can't treat somebody different just because we don't recognize them from a series of 6 prior elections. While I speak about Ward 7, I also speak about our polling location. It was mentioned earlier, another ward that has a small polling location. We do too. We're a very congested neighborhood. And so while we are seeing new faces every year with registration lines out the door, I can promise you as a moderator who spends equal amounts of time going in and out of the building to make sure everybody is following regulation outside, that there is nowhere in that neighborhood that a bus can park undetected or show up unidentified. We have one bus that shows up to deliver voters to our polling location, and it's from the local retirement community on the corner of Main Street.
Time.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Dan, you wanted to speak?
Yep. Thank you for letting me speak. Aaron Thalman, Thoman, and I live in Nashua. I've been involved with elections since about 2000, and after the 2012 election, when we had such a huge influx of same-day registrations, we started looking at the process, got a copy of the same-day registration lists, so we could look at it to see, just to look at it, because it's public information. And it was a very hard process to get that information. And that's part of the problem with voting, is the transparency. City of Nashua hired a lawyer for the right to knows, and in the 2020 election, he was pretty much saying no to everything. I did get a copy of the same-day registration, and just in one ward, we had someone voting from Taggart Drive in Nashua. It's an industrial area. The guy, I went to that address, it's a dentist office. He's got a car with mass plates on it, and he's voting from there. Now, then we have another man voting in 848 from Royal Crest, who put down he lived in the clubhouse. So I called the Royal Crest number, which led me to call Texas. And I said, do you know this man at your Nashua location? Oh, no. And I said, well, he says he lives in the clubhouse. And so I said, will there be people in the clubhouse? She said, absolutely not. So anyways, it turned out he's using an alias. Is that against the law to use an alias when you register to vote? I don't know. I can't ask anybody though. There's more fraud than you think. For me to find just these two on one same-day registration list, you know there's thousands more. The problem that we have, the confidence level, I think, could be improved for people like me who cares about my election, cares about my vote counts. I've been on the website, the Secretary of State website for elections, looking for how do I make myself more informed about the election process. A lot of it is a lot of common sense. You know, you're supposed to go behind the rail once you get your ballot. You do your thing in the booth, you put it in the box, and you leave. That's all you have to do. But there's people, you know, taking their ballot wherever they want. So anyways, looking on the Secretary of State's website, looking for some kind of training. What training do the moderators get? What training do the clerks get? And there is a link there for training, but you can't access it unless you have permission. Why can't the training that these people get be public knowledge? Why do I have to try and figure out what is supposed to go on election day? Everyone should be able to know exactly what is supposed to be going on. Does that make sense to you? So let's get something online so that we as American citizens, we as residents of the state of New Hampshire can have a clear understanding of what's supposed to be going on election day. I mean, I know the young man that just spoke. The young man that just spoke, it's a hard job, very hard job, and it is very complicated. So the original thing I was going to talk about is the bloated checklist. In 2020, the general election, off the state of New Hampshire's website, there was 67,249 people on the voter registration list for 2020. The same-day registrations in that election was 6,198 for the city. That's ridiculous. 2021 municipal election, after they did the census purge, 49,159. They took almost 20,000 people off that list. That is outrageous. The ballots cast in 2020 were 45,833. The Secretary of State's office reported, I believe, 65% of the people voted. Is actually 93%. Is that a realistic number?
Time.
Is that a realistic number?
Ray Chadwick.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary and staff and committee members. Thank you for hearing me. Thanks for your work and commitment to the election system. My name is Ray Chadwick. I'm chairman of Granite State Taxpayers. We're a taxpayer advocacy group. For over a decade, we've involved ourselves advocating for election laws that are simple to understand, resistant to fraud, available exclusively to the residents of New Hampshire. I've listened to discussions, and we all talk about the disparity of opinions, widespread voter fraud, no voter fraud, etc. I wanted to leave you with the observation. I think those disparities come from two issues primarily, not just those, but primarily. Out-of-state voters and affidavits. New Hampshire is a state that knowingly allows residents of other states to come here, register to vote, often on election day, and vote. An out-of-state driver's license is certainly a form of identity, but in every state in this country, to get one, you have to prove you're a resident of the state that issues it. So this is one state that does that no other state does. Most people are surprised to know that, and most people consider that to be problematic, i.e. fraud. Our Secretary of State actually keeps data on the number of people that exercise that in each election. That's how I know that in 2016, 6,540 people came here, registered to vote on election day, using an out-of-state driver's license for ID, i.e. the document that proved they were residents of those other states. 2,546 of them came from Massachusetts, where there are 3 registered Democrats for every Republican. If they voted in the same ratio, who knows, that would have thrown an extra 1,123 votes into the Democrat column. And our U.S. Senate race was decided by 1,017 votes. So this is an issue that, in my opinion, most people cannot understand why that happens. It all goes back to the Constitution that says you can vote if you're an inhabitant if you have your domicile here. But every other state requires you to prove residency to register to vote. In Massachusetts, they require this, and by the way, if you don't bring your proof to the polls, they'll give you a provisional ballot, and you have until the end of the polls, the end of polling that night, to come back with proof. Otherwise, you don't vote. So things like that make sense to most people when they talk about election integrity. You know, why don't we do that? The out-of-state voter situation is one. The affidavit situation is another one. And that is an option where people can come in and if they say they don't have proof or don't, they can just say who they are, say where they live, and vote. As I mentioned, Massachusetts allows that, but you have to bring your proof back before they'll allow you to cast a vote. So there's a big dispute, of course, upon this right now. There have been a series of efforts to close up these out-of-state voter options. And usually they are brought up by one party and sued against by the other party. We're nonpartisan, so I won't comment on that, but we observed it. So I think those couple of issues would be moving us a long way towards the average individual seeing themselves unworried about whether their vote is counted, and more particularly not negated by someone from another state. I live in Bedford. I have a house there, I register the cars, I pay taxes, all this stuff. And I know that right behind me in the voter line, there may be somebody else who is registered using a Montana driver's license and will go back to Montana when they're, whatever they're here for, job assignment, temporary assignment, when the semester's over, whatever, their vote counts along with mine. We filed a brief...
1 minute.
Thank you. We filed a brief with the New Hampshire Supreme Court pointing out that this is an unequal application of the law, which is equal application of the law required by our Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. So those things I would suggest to you are the fount of a lot of the concerns about voter fraud. Most people think it's fraud, but in actuality, it's legal under our laws. And I'll leave you with 2 Supreme Court decisions. One is U.S. Supreme Court Dunn versus Bloomstein, March of '72. We have noted that the states have the power to require that voters be bona fide residents of the relevant political jurisdiction. And the second one is Supreme Court, July 2021, Brnovich versus Democrat National Committee. An entirely legitimate state interest is the prevention of fraud. So anyway, I thank you again for listening. I thank you for your commitment to the electoral system.
One more, this will be it, but 8:30 is about 4 minutes away.
Thank you. I'm Jack Currier, live here in Nashua. I serve as the Ward 8 clerk. I've been the clerk for 2 election cycles and then a ballot inspector before that. I'd just like to say that I think the training, the online training that the state does is quite good. I give a thumbs up to that. One woman just previously said, the public couldn't get to it. I guess I don't have any comment on that, but for us poll workers, it's quite good. In terms of certification, which you've heard tonight, I'm not a big fan of that. Quite frankly, I've done the training 3 times. 2 or 3 months later, it's out of my head, but the online training, we all do it with the upcoming election, and I think we're all quite sharp on how to handle and properly take care of the voting registration. I'd also like to say that the absentee ballot, I believe the state accounts for those quite accurately. There was a fella here saying, yeah, you can request an absentee ballot, you can show up in person with it in your hand, and you can still vote, but I think the state has a quite a tight system to not let somebody vote twice on that. My biggest concern is with the AccuVote machines. In Ward 8, they were jamming quite a bit. There's different error codes that show up. And I think it was the very first speaker who was saying about how a lot of times moderators have been here for years. And I thank him for saying the average age is 70, because I'm not there. It's making me feel young. But there's a lot of different error codes, like the ballot jam's not counted. Ballots jammed, it is counted. E1, E2. I asked just before Sue Lovering retired, and God bless her, I hope she's having a great retirement, but I think we deserve or need the instructions on those AccuVote machines, how to unjam, etc. It's very important, because I'm standing there with 2 broken machines, and it looks horrible to the voting public. And then one other point, I guess I say this more as a citizen than as a ward clerk, but I first got involved in this because I felt an erosion of confidence in the New Hampshire voting system. And my neighbors and friends were like, oh, don't get involved in that, but I wanted to run into the fire, and now I'm the ward clerk. But I ran for alderman at Ward 8 in 2013. So it's the summer of 2013. There were about 1,300 registered voters on the list. I knocked on pretty much every doorbell. And running as an undeclared, I went to everyone, and I would say this: whether you're right, left, or undeclared, nobody trusts you, and you're asking for everybody's vote. But it wasn't long in the process where someone told me in Ward 8 that there were a bus that showed up at Bicentennial School, and I'm standing there thinking, if I wasn't looking for their vote, I'd tell them like they're nuts. But that was on Spindlewick Drive, and then I'd hear it on East Dunstable, and then I'd hear it on Salmon Brook Drive, and over the 3 months that I canvassed the whole ward, I probably heard from 10 different people in different parts of the ward, which I'm confident were not associated or part of some online conspiracy theory. And it was disappointing to me because I felt that there is an erosion of trust. And I was very, I just met with our ward moderator Monday night as we prepare for the September primary. And that's where I became aware of Senate Bill 418. I was excited by it. He was complaining, and I'd like to read this one sentence, if I can get my phone to expand, because my reading glasses aren't that great. It says, it requires election officials to mark ballots in a way that could identify voters and reveal who they voted for. If someone could tell me how that can happen, I don't think that is any different what's being proposed than an absentee ballot. But if there's an answer that someone has, I'd like to hear it right now. If nobody has an answer, I don't think that's possible. And I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
All right, so the public testimony is closed. Ken wants to say something, and then we're done.
I just want to make a statement that when people come up here and they make a statement that this committee is not listening, and not responding, and not asking questions, and inferring that we don't care, I take offense to that. I have listened and taken very careful notes of everyone's testimony, whether I had previously agreed with it or not. I intend to report on all of that and share my comments when we put together our report. Brenda Town came up here. She was concerned that she prepared a statement of the statewide audit of performance, and then nobody asked questions. I ask questions when I don't understand testimony. I've reached out to people who have testified. I've researched, found, and then reached out to people and asked them for clarifications. And Mrs. Town is one of those people that I have spoken to on multiple occasions. So I want it clear that I take my position up here very seriously, and I don't follow up. It doesn't mean that it's not taken seriously. And there may be other people on this committee that are in the same position and feel the same way. So when we have an understanding, it's a waste of people's time to follow up. I respect tremendously the work that Brenda has done, tremendously, and I think that she's done a tremendous service to the state and the work of the people that she has shared all of those efforts in. I applaud all of you. I want to make that clear, so this is not a personal attack. I just want her to know and everyone else to know that I take my position very clearly, and I want that on the record because I did not deserve that particular statement as directed to me as a member of this committee.
Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.